in the heart of a sun-blistered desert, where the earth cracked open like ancient parchment, and even the air seemed to have forgotten the scent of life. Two German shepherds, left behind after the disbandment of a military outpost, began a journey without name, without command, without destination. They did not carry orders. No one led the way. And yet, somewhere in a jagged ravine split by heat and silence, they stumbled upon a living soul bound and fading, suspended between the fragile breath of life and the slow collapse of death, tied down and long forgotten. What force could compel a spirit, once surrendered, to rise again? And why did the silence between these three forsaken beings, so quiet, so wordless, reach into the hearts of millions? Because this story is not just about survival. It is about something far greater: the freedom to choose love. The final rays of sunlight spilled westward across the borderlands like a veil of amber dust seeping through cracks in the sky, casting their glow upon rusted coils of barbed wire slumped in disrepair like the brittle bones of some once proud beast that had guarded this land in solemn dignity. The great iron gates, once standing tall and resolute, now hung crooked and half shut, their hinges moaning with the sorrow of rust. An aching metallic whisper only those long forgotten would still know how to hear. Across a slab of cracked concrete, dried and scored by the fossilized tracks of military tires, two shadows moved in silence, gliding through what humanity had once declared a central tactical zone, though now no sirens screamed, no boots thundered in formation, no barked commands cut the air from static-laced speakers. All traces of order had been erased, swept clean by the wind, leaving behind only silence, and two nameless dogs who no longer bore rank, unit, or place in any charted map of war. Aegis walked first. He did not hunch like one defeated, nor lift his head like one still watching. He walked as if he had made peace with the fact that no one would return, but was not yet ready to stop moving forward. The steel-black sheen of his coat caught the dusk faintly, a fading glint like memory losing its shape, as if he too were slowly dissolving from the world's recollection. A long tear ran along the edge of his left ear, not from claws, not from teeth, but from a shard of metal during a final emergency drill. And though it had not fully healed, Aegis paid it no mind. Sul followed just behind. Lighter, younger, with fur kissed by burnt gold and slivers of silver twilight, his movement shimmered like a streak of lost light wandering between dusk and dust. He did not glance sideways. He did not look back. He simply kept a distance of 3 measured steps behind Aegis, not close enough to interfere, not far enough to be alone. A spacing once drilled into him through repetition, now no longer commanded but kept out of instinct, a muscle memory clinging to the last fragments of an identity wiped clean by time and silence. The rows of buildings that once housed communications gear and personnel rotating shifts around the clock now stood hollow, their windows gaping open like toothless mouths. A lone radio still rested on a windowsill, its battery light long since extinguished. Beneath it, a line of wind-blown sand spilled over shattered tiles, as if time itself had begun to move in, slowly claiming the spaces mankind had abandoned. On one wall, faint black letters still clung in streaked paint. K9 Training Sector, authorized personnel only. But there was no one left to enforce it. Sul paused at a doorway he knew by heart, the place where he used to curl up each night at the feet of a young soldier with brown hair who sometimes hummed lullabies in Spanish. There were no blankets now, no rations, only a shallow dent in the cement, an imprint once carved by fur and warmth, now coated in a soft layer of dust, like a blanket of memory left behind, and left to dry. Aegis didn't turn back. He had seen the place, and he had already chosen not to look again. No one spoke, no one asked, no one gave an order, no one disagreed. And so they continued. Two silhouettes walking in the same direction, though their steps did not match, through the final gate where the sign once declaring Fort Red Rock, Unit 712, now lay half-buried and rotting, its letters peeking out from withered vines like a farewell never sent. No one told them this was the last day. No one came to remove their tracking chips. No one unclipped their nameplates. No one conducted a final check. No one remembered they were still here, left behind in the final wave of redeployment before the entire outpost dissolved. But Aegis and Sewell remembered, not in pictures, but in scent, in echoes, in the hollow where a sit command no longer came, but where their muscles still twitched in reflex, in the fragmented dreams where a voice had once called out their names, only to vanish into nothing. The wind from the south drifted through a jagged crack in the rocks, carrying with it the scent of rust and ash. Aegis raised his head. His ears flicked up, then fell again. Not because he sensed danger, but because the absence of sound itself was the loudest proof that nothing remained. Sewell gently gnawed on a scrap of fabric caught beneath the base of the flagpole, a torn piece of a soldier's shirt, still marked with red thread at the shoulder. He didn't know what it meant, but he didn't let go. He carried it, as if some part of him still needed to believe there had once been a place he belonged. The sun dipped lower now, finally sinking behind their backs, and the shadows of the two dogs stretched long across the cracked desert floor, reaching towards the distant horizon like a question that had yet to be answered. Where now? Why? With whom? No one replied. No one knew the destination. No one carried a map. There was only sand and memory, and eyes that had not yet closed. Aegis stopped at the crest of the first dune beyond the outpost perimeter. He didn't look back, but the way his paws planted into the sand told of a silent anchoring, and when the wind ran through his fur, his body trembled, not from cold, but from the weight of choosing, for the first time in his life, a direction without anyone behind him to validate that it was right. Sewell came up beside him. Not prompted, not called, not signaled, just walked forward until the last of the 3 steps disappeared beneath him, and stood there, not too close to blur the line between them, not too far to stand apart, but precisely where presence itself became the only answer left to give to a decision no one else had witnessed. That the space between them no longer needed to be measured. And then they kept moving forward, without a map, without a commander, without expectation, but carrying with them something no force on earth could strip away, the will to survive and the quiet memory that had never left their side, a memory of loyalty that asked for no reward and a waiting that demanded no reply. Ahead lay the desert, but somewhere between the sand and the wind, something, unnamed, unseen, was waiting to be found. A life, a purpose, or perhaps, as simple and vital as this, a declaration that they were still alive. Aegis stepped down the first slope of sand with the deliberate weight of someone who understood that every movement was more than just a shift in space. It was an affirmation, silent but unyielding, that he had chosen to walk toward a place no one had named. The sand beneath his feet was dry and fine, so fine that it barely held the shape of his footprints, as if the desert itself refused to keep the mark of anything or anyone who had wandered through. But Aegis did not need to be remembered. He only needed to keep going. Sewell followed close behind, his silver-gray fur catching the low, slanting light of a sunset not yet fully extinguished. His gait was neither quick nor urgent, but held a strange, steady rhythm, as if the desert, in its vast silence, was pressing each grain of sand into the beat of his heart, ensuring that no step faltered, No motion broke, no path veered off into the boundless void. There was no trail, no landmarks, no foreign sound to pierce the thick hush that wrapped the space around them. And no one led absolutely. At times, Aegis moved ahead, choosing a direction based on where the scent in the wind carried less of the dust's sting. Other times, Sul veered to the right, pausing for a few seconds, as if listening for a signal whispered from beneath the earth, one that human ears could not comprehend. Between them, no words were exchanged. The silence in their motion was the language, a form of pact never spoken, never broken. The wind swept across, not harsh, but devoid of gentleness. It was the kind of wind that had lived too long in solitude and forgotten how to comfort. It crawled over Aegis' back like the rough hand of a builder, long swallowed by the very land he helped raise. Aegis lowered his head slightly, not from exhaustion, but as if to remind himself that even a strong body only holds direction when the mind stays alert. Behind him, Sul sneezed, a spray of dust released with every short breath, yet his ears stayed erect, his gaze never leaving the shadow Aegis cast on the ground ahead. They crossed a stone plain, sanded down by wind until it resembled a frozen lake. No edges, no sharpness, only silence in its purest, most absolute form. At the center stood a broken post, no taller than half a man's height, coated in dust and brittle vines. Aegis paused, his nose gently touching the weathered metal where a sign or device had once been mounted, now only a scar of rust clinging to it, like longing that had never found its release. Sul asked no questions. He simply circled to the right, searching the area as if he already understood that Aegis was speaking to the past. As the sky began to shed its golden tones and sink into a heavy ash gray, the two dogs approached the edge of a slope, where the desert fractured into shallow basins, each one a silent mouth of sand, gaping just beneath the cracked skin of the land. Aegis slowed his pace, his feet sinking deeper into the powder-fine grains. He had to measure every step, distributing his weight with care, for even a half-angle misstep could collapse the balance and pull him down, swallowed whole. Sul did not follow the same path. He veered left, climbing a low mound and tracing a ridge of stone where traces of long-gone water still lingered in the form of dry moss, pale threads of silver tangled with dust. And there he found it, not water, but a rusted metal grate buried at an angle in the sand, perhaps once the drainage cover of a long, dead base. Sul pawed at it lightly, scooping a thin layer of sand across its face, then turned to look at Aegis. The glance was brief, without expectation, but enough to say, in a voice that needed no sound, "Something once lived here." They didn't stop, because where life once existed, memory still remains. And where memory remains is precisely where they must not stay. Along the way, Aegis came to a sudden halt. His ear twitched. Sul reacted instantly, not by lunging forward, but by lowering himself to the ground, eyes fixed ahead. There was no enemy, no distinct sound. But in the tension between light and shadow, between sand and wind, something shifted, as if the world had drawn a breath and now held it, waiting. Aegis turned left, abandoning the direct route. Sul followed without a word. 12 minutes later, they emerged past a field of charred black stone, the site of an explosion long ago. No debris, no wreckage, but the scent of old smoke clung to the soil. Had they continued straight, they would have stepped into the very center, where the earth still pulsed with the dying heat of stones not yet fully cooled. Their detour wasn't born of fear. It came from the instinct of creatures once trained to survive, now learning how to live by the pulse of their own senses. When night fell a second time, not from clouds, but from the earth itself as light was drained from it, Aegis found a crevice between two upright walls of stone, just wide enough to lie curled, just high enough to shield his neck from the wind. Sul needed no command. He slipped in behind, curving his body to fit the contour of Aegis' back like a soft barricade, steady and unyielding. No one slept immediately. No one closed their eyes at once, but no one barked. No one left. Their breaths began to slow, not from fatigue, but because they had chosen this place for the night. In the middle of the night, when the sand began to cool and the wind no longer carried a blade of grit sharp enough to cut the skin, Sul opened his eyes. Not because he had woken, but because he had never slept deeply. He turned his head northward, where there were no lights, no motion, nothing but perfect emptiness. And it was there, in that flawless silence, that Sul's eyes rested. Not to observe, but to affirm, something still lies ahead. Aegis did not move. His ears twitched gently with each passing breeze, but he remained still. No action was needed, because in this moment, where silence was evenly split between two living forms, nothing needed to be corrected. Nothing needed to be rearranged. Everything was in its place. And tomorrow, when light returns, they will continue. Because in this moment, this breathless pause where silence was shared evenly between two bodies once shaped by discipline and now held together by something quieter, there was nothing to fix, nothing to realign, nothing out of place. Everything had found where it belonged, and tomorrow, when the light returned, they would move forward once again. Dawn did not rise with bursts of color or triumphant sound. It arrived slowly, gently, threading itself through grains of sand like a whisper unsure if it should speak, brushing hesitantly across the stone ledges with a warmth too fragile to claim presence, until it finally came to rest, soft, trembling, against the tip of Aegis's ear, which quivered in his half-sleep like a flag catching the weight of a message it could almost understand. He didn't open his eyes, not yet, for his body had already sensed the shift in the moisture on the wind, the subtle reversal in current brushing across his neck and his skin, long trained to read time, not in clocks, but in breezes, knew with quiet certainty that this was the hour when night begins to lose its grip on life. That fragile threshold between existing and enduring, thin as a single raised hair on unhealed skin. Sul stirred first. He lifted his head slowly from where it had rested along Aegis's spine, inhaling not in fear or instinctive caution, but with the focused purpose of confirming that something in the air had changed, something faint, elusive, that didn't belong to this desert or to the ghost of the base they'd left behind. It was a scent with roots, but not the kind easily named. Perhaps rotted wood, or dry straw, or the stale sweat of a creature whose skin had softened too long under the sun. Sul stepped out from the rock hollow, his paws barely disturbing the cool morning sand, his ears rotating toward the east, toward a silent fracture in the landscape, where the earth split like a scar that had never healed, a ravine stretching between two low ridgelines that remained unnamed on any surviving map. Aegis followed, saying nothing, questioning nothing, simply moving forward with the solemn steadiness of a current that has always known where its center lies, drawn not by sight or scent, but by the intangible call of something in need of being heard. The ravine opened up slowly, like the jaw of some ancient creature that had slumbered for centuries beneath the earth, and now, without warning, cracked open to daylight to reveal all it had hidden. Secrets long decayed into silence. The rock walls grew taller on either side, forming a natural corridor where the sun broke into distorted fragments, casting dappled patches of color like careless brushstrokes, flung across a canvas of ochre and ash, creating a dreamscape of muted memory, incomplete and unresolved. And at the farthest point of the ravine, deep within the crevice, where stone bulges and leaf shadow cloaked the floor, where light squeezed thin between vertical walls, there stood a shape that did not belong. Aegis came to a halt at the exact spot where the stone narrowed and the light could barely breathe between the walls, not because he heard a cry or caught a scent, but because his eyes, sharpened by silence and softened by experience, suddenly found something that didn't move, yet wasn't part of the rock. It stood there, not quite upright, not quite fallen, as if its entire being had been caught and suspended at the intersection of staying and dissolving. It was a young horse, thin beyond measure, its ribs pronounced like the bars of a cage pressing through parchment skin, its coat coated in ash-colored dust that clung to every patch where fur had fallen away. It was tethered to a slanted wooden stake, half sunken into cracked soil that could no longer hold weight. A coarse rope looped around its neck, frayed and sun-hardened, had cut deep just beneath the jawline, leaving a swollen red ridge like a whip mark that had seared not only flesh, but memory. It could not lie down. It could not turn its head. It could only stand, or more accurately, remain suspended on the trembling legs that had long since forgotten the rhythm of a gallop. Its eyes were wide open, not in terror, but in the absence of remembering how to close. The pupils had clouded, filmed over with a chalky glaze that blurred all detail, reflecting only the colorless sky above and the cracked hopelessness below. And something in that stare, something beyond exhaustion, beyond pain, a kind of surrender so complete it no longer resisted, caused even Aegis to lower his head, to tilt his ears just slightly to one side, as though the silence radiating from that hollow body could not be borne head-on. Sewell halted a few steps to the right, not looking directly at the horse's body, but at the sand beneath it, at the patch of earth ringed with overlapping hoofprints, circles drawn and redrawn like the ghost of motion that had once tried to run, then failed, then been reeled back by a tightening noose. Each time the creature had tried to retreat, the rope had snapped it back into place, and over time those movements had carved their own prison, not with metal or bars, but with futility, pressed again and again into the dust until hope itself stopped replicating. The wind shifted through the ravine in faint, mournful gusts, carrying with it the scent of old blood, bitter sweat, and something else, something raw and heavy and unnameable, like the breath of every tear ever shed into this earth, now exhaled as cold vapor. Spirit, though they did not yet know its name, though no one had spoken it, the name had already chosen itself. It didn't move as the two figures approached. Its legs, too thin to carry, held their position in a stillness that looked more like a frozen collapse than a choice. Its neck dipped just below spine level, not in surrender, but with the last dregs of defiance against everything that had ever tried to force it upright. No whinny came, no flinch, no final jolt of panic, only the faintest involuntary tremble, those twitches of muscle that linger not because life is fighting, but because death hasn't quite arrived. The body was no longer a vessel of will, only a cage for a soul stripped of language, standing there not as a plea, but as a period, drawn so thin that a single strong wind could erase it. Aegis slowed, each pawfall releasing small circles in the sand, echoing the forgotten hoofprints that surrounded them. He did not rush. He did not draw near. He kept a respectful distance, far enough to give the creature space to remain unseen if it chose to, close enough that his gaze could meet its gaze, not as a question, not as a promise, but as an acknowledgement. I see you. Soul remained steady, posture patient, eyes trained on the sway of the frayed rope. His ears twitched once, only once, when a shallow breath escaped the horse's nose, not loud, not sharp, but real enough to confirm that the flicker of presence had not yet been extinguished. And in that moment where everything else fell still, time, wind, vision, even breath, the three beings simply existed beside one another. No force, no command, no request, just a quiet alignment of broken shapes that recognized something in each other. And from that cracked center of the ravine, something deep, something raw, something as ancient as instinct began to stir. Not because anyone said it should, not because someone needed it to, but because the ruin standing before them deserved not to be abandoned again. Aegis stepped back half a pace, not in retreat, but to feel the tension that hung in the air, a pressure so thick it felt like even the breeze was pausing, uncertain whether to continue or to yield to the wordless decision now unfolding between these living remnants. He did not glance at Soul. He didn't need to, because every second they had once spent in formation had trained them to read the tiniest shift without language. And when words become too distant, too costly, it is movement that speaks loudest, with truth deep enough to be understood. Aegis tilted his head to the left, then slowly lowered it, jaws parting with a deliberate slowness, as if even the act of opening his mouth must be done gently, so as not to let the dust sneak into that old wound in his gum. The one he had earned during an emergency drill where he had been forced to bite through a steel mesh to rescue a teammate trapped inside a burning warehouse. A wound that had since healed over, but still throbbed with a quiet sting each time it encountered the salt-laced grit, a constant reminder that sometimes memories no longer bleed, yet still burn with their full fire. He touched the rope, not with his teeth, not yet, but with his nose first, testing for dryness, for tension, for the place where the first thread might give way. The scent of dried blood clung to the fiber like resin formed from long pain, sharp, metallic, persistent, almost as if Spirit's own memories had been wound into each twisted strand and no one had ever found a way to unwind them. Sewell moved to the right, without awaiting instruction. He selected a stake, one where the rope wrapped for the final time before stretching taut toward Spirit's neck. His front paws scraped into the hardened layer of earth, lifting the caked dust to reveal the broken root of the peg. He did not growl, did not howl. He simply dug, steady, rhythmic, precise, as though unearthing a landmine he himself had buried in another lifetime, now returned to salvage whatever might still be alive inside. Aegis bit down on the lower part of the rope, where the soil had caked into a natural cement. His jaws closed but did not clench. Instead, his teeth moved with the slow insistence of scissors, separating the brittle cord layer by layer, with movements that were firm, yet careful. Each frayed strand came undone like torn fragments of time, falling into the sand and dissolving into the wind, never to be gathered again. Blood welled at his gum, metallic on his tongue. But he did not stop. Spirit shifted his head slightly, but offered no resistance. His body gave a small, involuntary jerk, the kind born of past training, of being yanked without warning. But this time, there was no force, no pain, no command, and in his still clouded eyes, something new began to shimmer, faint, barely visible, like sunlight about to touch the surface of water after seasons of being veiled. Sewell dug deeper until the base of the stake lay exposed. He lowered his head, gripped the upper rope, where the knot met the stake's body, and gave a single motion, not to snap, but to tilt. And when the rope shifted off-center, the tension around Spirit's neck eased, just a little, but enough for the horse to exhale one long breath, as if his entire rib cage had been given back the right to expand. Aegis bit harder. This time, the final fibers tore with a muted snap, not quite the sound of something breaking, but more like the echo of a long-delayed verdict, soft but profound, sending tremors through every cell that heard it, as if to announce, "What seemed permanent has now been undone." The rope fell to the ground, curling like the husk of a dead serpent. Spirit took a half-step back, legs trembling, forelegs buckling before catching himself with all the strength left in him. But he didn't run. He didn't bolt. He didn't rear like a creature suddenly freed. He simply stood there, his body quivering like a fevered leaf under wind, his eyes moving from Aegis to soul, then to the earth, where the rope that once held him now lay harmless, powerless, and without command. Not a sound was made. But among those three beings, what had happened did not require a name. Spirit could not understand why these two, different in form, without saddle or rider, had chosen to stop here, at a place no one else had ever stopped. But he understood, in the way only those who have been bound, who have been driven to the edge of collapse, can understand. That sometimes freedom does not come with warning, and kindness does not come with reason. Aegis turned and began walking toward the northern opening, without gesture, without push. Sul moved first, stepping slightly ahead and to the side, not too close, but always watching, like a fire standing guard at the edge of twilight. Spirit remained still, head lowered, nose near the earth, drawing his first breath of unbound air, then lifted his gaze, just a little, as if to ask, "If I follow, will you keep going?" No one nodded, no one signaled, but Aegis's steps remained steady. Sul's stance held patient. And for the first time since countless days spent in bondage, Spirit raised his left foreleg, softly, slowly, and placed it into the sand ahead, where no prints had marked the way, but where two shadows, belonging to creatures not of his kind, waited without promise, offering only one thing: freedom. The light from the west was not blinding. It was thin and tender, like a ribbon of silk drawn long through layers of dust, settling gently upon the brittle coat of Spirit, casting a pale brown glow like the last leaves clinging to dry branches in the season's end. Each step of the young horse whispered through the wind, not proclaiming, "I believe," not questioning, "Who are you?" but simply stating, "I still have the strength to go on." And somehow, in that simplicity, there was a quiet miracle. Aegis did not turn back. He only slowed, slightly, not from weariness, but to tune the rhythm. Sul maintained his position at the flank, lifting his head now and then to check the horizon, his ears attuned to the faintest stirrings, as if the wind itself might carry a message from a world they had yet to reach. 3 beings, 3 breaths, 3 silhouettes. Yet as they moved across the vast stretch of sand, they seemed to melt into a single outline, like a memory walking through the ancient wilderness, searching for itself. No reason was spoken, no destination declared, no map unfolded, no instinct held above the rest. And yet nothing halted the steps, tracing themselves upon this rough earth. Aegis sensed the currents shifting, the wind carrying scents just a touch more humid, as if moisture had brushed the belly of the desert. And the western light, soft and unspeaking, became the most powerful invitation of all. Keep going, just keep going. Spirit kept his distance, not too near, not hesitant. His first strides still trembled, but each time his hoof touched the sand, something flickered a little brighter in those once dim eyes, like the sand itself was helping his body remember. A journey has begun, even if no one has yet named it. His dust-flecked coat began to lift slightly with each passing breeze. Breezes now cooler, coming from the west, carrying the faintest hint of flowers, like the scent of a distant spring he had never lived through, but somehow believed was real. As the path stretched across gentle dunes and fields of shattered rock, they did not avoid the terrain. They moved through it, Soul took the lead whenever scattered stones hinted at unstable ground, patterns that meant the earth might sink. He did not bark. He only changed direction slightly, and Aegis understood. Spirit came to understand as well. The movement of the two dogs was not the choreography of predators, but a harmony of memory and perception, shaped by training no one had ever given to a horse, but one a horse could feel, through bone, through wind, through silence. There came a moment when all three paused beside the withered remains of a tree. Its roots stretched upward into the empty sky like desperate hands, frozen in the act of reaching for something they could never grasp, something already gone. Aegis sat down, not to rest, but to look out toward the horizon, not searching for a sign, but simply bearing witness to the distance. Sul moved closer to the base of the tree, dug a shallow line into the earth like an old habit rising from muscle memory, then stopped and lay down with his back turned toward Spirit. Not as a gesture of defense, nor as an invitation, but simply to let the quiet presence of his spine speak the only language that mattered. If you need something to lean on, I am here. Spirit remained standing. Not far, but not yet close enough to touch. He lowered his head, drawing in the scent of the soil near the base of the dead roots, the scent of something that had once lived a very long time, and now had nothing left to offer but the memory of grounding. Perhaps he did not understand how long the tree had been gone, or perhaps it didn't matter. But when his front hooves inched forward, slow and uncertain, then bent slightly, folding his body into a curve that leaned towards the base of the tree without quite surrendering, his eyes half-lidded beneath the soft light trickling through the cracks in the stone overhead. Then, in that very moment, the earth quietly accepted another story being written into it. And when the wind shifted for the third time, carrying with it a faint chill rather than heat, all three rose, not because anyone called, but because the motion passed from one body into the next, with the ease of breath passed between ribs. Aegis stepped forward first. Sul adjusted his stance after a soft, almost dismissive sneeze, and Spirit, though his knees still trembled, lifted his left leg before the right, as if the language of movement had finally returned to his limbs without needing to be taught again. The sun continued to descend, but now its golden light no longer scorched. It poured across the ground in thick, mellow hues, like ripe honey settling over the backs of the three figures, painting their shadows into long, unbroken lines stretching eastward, shadows that did not just mark passing time, but seemed to pull memory itself away from the present, clearing space for something unnamed, something not yet born, but no longer tied to what came before. The horizon ahead did not grow closer. It receded with each step, as if testing their endurance, as if measuring how far they were willing to go without guarantees. But none of the three paused to curse the distance. None turned around. None waited for affirmation. Because now, somewhere between unclaimed earth and unpromised light, the only thing that remained was the steady rhythm of footsteps, offered not to anyone, sent to no one, but spoken like a quiet vow, that when there is a reason to keep walking, even if its shape is still unclear, then the light at the end will begin to open, one breath, one step, one heartbeat at a time. By the time the sun had vanished completely behind the last of the dunes, leaving the sky ahead veiled in a muted ash gray laced with the final hints of purple twilight, the three figures, Aegis, Sul, and Spirit, had curved toward a shallow basin where the dry skeletons of long-dead cacti lay slumped across the sand as if they had forgotten how to rise. There was no scent of water, no track of life, but the ground here felt softer, almost imperceptibly so, as though something had once passed through below, leaving behind a trace of moisture that hadn't entirely faded from the earth's memory. Aegis moved first, his nose close to the ground, registering every nuance in the texture of the soil. Sul veered right, instinctively circling out like a silent satellite checking ahead. Spirit followed behind, his gait still uneven, his joints still tender, but the rhythm of the others carried him forward like a current wrapping gently around worn stone. And then, as the ravine opened slightly beneath the sand, revealing a darker patch of earth, not because of grass, but because of layers burned and cooled again and again by sun and storm, they saw it. A rusted metal trough, tilted, half-buried, as though it had once been dragged away from a forgotten agricultural outpost and then abandoned mid-motion. The trough wasn't deep, just a curved crescent of steel, its outer rim stained with red-brown rust, its interior mottled with patches of green mold. But what made them all stop was the shallow sheen at the bottom. Not much, not enough to reflect. But still, it was water. And the scent of it, not fresh, not clean, but holding that unmistakable trace of something that had once sustained life, was enough to make Spirit falter. His hind legs collapsed in an involuntary shiver, his body listing to one side as if the very recognition of what he saw had unspooled the last thread holding him upright. His eyes locked on the trough, not with hunger, but with disbelief, as though unsure whether this was a gift or a mirage too cruel to trust. Aegis did not touch it. He stood beside the trough, positioning his body just close enough to intercept any threat, his nose hovering above the steel rim, testing the vapor rising from the cold metal surface. Sul remained above, on higher ground, his ears erect, his gaze fixed on the western ridgeline, as though he had silently appointed himself guardian of this fragile moment below. Spirit staggered forward again, his front legs folding until his chest met the sand, the entire frame of his body unraveling like a rope finally cut loose after hours of tension. He tilted his head, nose brushing the rim of the trough. Not drinking yet, just inhaling, deeply, as if trying to confirm that this water, this moment, truly belonged to him. And then, with a tongue that moved slowly, reverently, he began to lick, drop by drop, not out of desperation, but like someone savoring a memory they thought had been erased. The northern wind rose, this time carrying not salt, but a faint coolness, as though some hidden spring beneath the earth had found its way to the surface, greeting a creature that had waited long enough to be worthy. Aegis lay down a few steps away, head angled toward Spirit, his eyes half-lidded, not sleeping, only watching, not as a sentinel, but as a witness. Sul did not move. He remained by the rock ledge, not tense, not braced, but never looking away from the direction the wind traveled, because night was coming, and no one could predict what might pass through this place. Not predators, not men, but the invisible things, the quiet things, that once made entire bases hold their breath. Spirit drank slowly, not because he was too thirsty, but because he had never been allowed to drink freely. Each mouthful was a recollection. Each lick dissolved something unseen, some tether long embedded in his neck. And when at last he lifted his head, exhaling through his nose in a long, unsteady breath, not from exhaustion, but from that stunned reaction of touching something he had believed was lost, Aegis still did not move. Only his ears twitched just once, just enough to confirm, Spirit is still breathing, and for now, that was all he needed to know. Sul broke position. He returned, not quickly, but with the kind of quiet gravity that respects what had just happened, stepping around behind Spirit and lying down on the opposite side from Aegis, forming a silent triangle. Not a formation for war, not a perimeter for defense, but a pattern of presence so steady that anything approaching, be it wind or threat or memory, would have to pause and ask itself if it was worthy. Above them, the sky held only a few faint stars, enough to say that night had begun settling into the sand, soaking into the metal, and slipping into the eyes that had not yet closed. They were no longer searching for peace. They simply needed a place where what they had just reclaimed, a sip of water, a breath of air, a moment of freedom, would not be taken from them again. But the earth, though it had long since mastered the art of silence over centuries of holding buried truths beneath its crust, still, on rare occasions, knew how to warn of things unwelcome. The sound of wheels grinding over broken stones was not loud, but it did not belong to nature. It did not echo like wind, nor soften like footsteps. It came heavy, intrusive, and with no hesitation. That sound bled in from the southwest, where low shrubs clung to the land like the bristles of a reptile crawling sideways beneath the moon. Spirit raised his head, not with a neigh, not trembling, only with a breath drawn too long, then broken halfway, as if even his own body could not bear to confirm the rising intuition clawing from deep within. Aegis rose, not with a growl, but in a single, grounded movement, so firm that the sand beneath his paws didn't scatter but sank, pressed downward by his weight. Sewell did not need prompting. He stood immediately at Aegis's right flank, eyes shifting in a single fluid motion from calm to blade sharp, like a sword drawn without sound, cutting only by presence. The pickup truck emerged from a cloud of red dust, dust rising in spirals like the breath of earth, disturbed and now angry. The vehicle was old, flaked with chipped paint, one headlight dimmed, the other shattered. And behind the wheel sat a man who held it in the way only those accustomed to controlling things weaker than themselves do. Thumb raised, elbow resting lazily on the open window, eyes sweeping forward with the casual coldness of someone who saw everything in front of him as objects simply not yet put back into their rightful place. He stepped out. His boots, caked in dust, hit the ground with the weight of a sentence repeated so many times it had become habit rather than judgment. Over his shoulder slung a length of rope, the kind used for hauling freight horses, worn and frayed, yet still bearing the shape of punishment, something Spirit had long ago learned to associate with toil. The man did not look at Aegis, nor at Soul. His eyes were fixed on Spirit, not with curiosity, but with the look of someone reclaiming what was once owned and now simply out of place. "So this is where you ran off to," he muttered, not loud, but loud enough for the ground to feel the arrogance that had never left his chest, even though he had been the first to abandon it all. He took another step forward, arm extending slightly, as though the rope could resume its former position by mere default. Aegis stepped in, placing himself directly between the man and Spirit. His ears stood, his neck lifted just enough, legs firm and unbent, gaze unwavering like an unspoken command reverberating from the memory of fences that once guarded a camp. He did not growl. He did not bare his teeth. He simply stood, like a wall made of something no word could define, but which anyone who had ever tried to cross knew well enough to stop before touching. Sewell remained at his side, unmoving, but the vein in his neck began to pulse, visible now like an underground spring too long suppressed, suddenly pushing toward rupture. The man frowned. He was not accustomed to being denied, especially not by a dog. He lowered the rope, pulling it tight through his fingers. His left foot crept forward a half step, eyes locked onto Aegis's, attempting to project dominance, to reach some primal hierarchy. But there was nothing in Aegis's gaze to catch. He did not blink, did not recoil, did not even see the man. He looked through him, as if whatever had arrived was nothing more than a shadow of memory no longer worthy of stirring. "Step aside," the man said, voice lower, weightier now, I raised it. It's mine. Sewell moved first. He circled half a step, coming up along the man's left flank, mouth slightly open, teeth barely parted, nostrils flared with one deep inhale. The wind shifted, right then, bringing the man's scent. Cheap cigarettes, engine grease, and beneath it all, the dry iron tang of old blood clinging to the cuff of his right sleeve. Aegis moved forward by half a step, slow, deliberate, but heavy. Dust swirled beneath his paws, lifting just enough to blur a direct gaze, to make any watcher squint if they wanted to keep looking. The man's arm twitched, shoulder pulling back in the split-second prelude of a throw. But before his fingers could clench around the rope, Sewell launched. He clamped onto the wrist mid-air, right at the vein beneath the skin. A bite not deep, but enough to break the movement, snap the reflex, drop the rope. The man stumbled, recoiling, his foot sliding against the gravel. Aegis surged forward at that exact instant, shoulder dropping low, thrusting into the man's lower torso with force, measured not in rage, but in necessity. The impact sent him backward, crashing against the truck's frame. His spine hitting metal, dust exploding around him, eyes wide now with something closer to realization than fear. For the first time in his life, he knew. He was no longer the most dangerous creature here. Spirit stood still, breathing hard, ears turned slightly back, but his gaze held, no longer averting. And in that moment the sun crept upward, slow but timely, stretching the shadows of 3 figures, 2 canines, 1 equine, until they swallowed the man's shape beside the red dust, turning him into a reflection trapped inside a broken mirror, warped, redundant, and no longer something worth keeping. The wind slipped sideways over the weathered slope, carrying a thin line of gray exhaust from the pickup truck, now abandoned, trailing behind like a wound left unwrapped. 2 miles south, between the crunch of slow tires over scattered stone and the familiar static of a radio buzzing softly within a vehicle's cabin, a patrol truck made its cautious way along the edge of a broken ridge, where the desert changed color from pale gold to deep brown, as if the land itself were preparing for something deeper, something older, something that had never been drawn on any modern map. The officer, hand resting lightly on the wheel, eyes scanning not just the road ahead but the sky above, moved with none of the urgency that usually accompanied duty. He had not heard an alert. He was not in pursuit. He was following a strange instinct, as though the ground beneath his tires had whispered something he couldn't ignore. And when he saw the pickup, tilted at the edge of a ditch, door ajar, dust still unsettled, his foot hit the brake before his mind had time to issue the command. On the earth, the prints of 2 dogs were clearly etched into the sand, one path intercepting, the other wrapping behind. The rope lay twisted, still damp at the end where it had cracked, and a patch of dark blood clung to the torn sleeve of a shirt thrown across the truck's rim, like something forgotten or discarded. Nearby, the imprint of a horse's hoof pressed deep into the ground, not smeared, not shaken, as though the creature had stood there a long time before lifting its foot and walking away. Not in alarm, not in ease, but in a state that was neither surrender nor suspicion. The officer stepped down slowly, head bowed, fingers brushing against the rope. His eyes paused on the tooth marks along the bite, then shifted to the dent in the vehicle's side, where silver paint had been warped inward, bent into a soft arc, a mark he recognized from his years assessing impact damage in the military. It was the kind of dent made not by a tool nor a fall, but by a body with weight, force, and above all, intention enough to shatter the space between. The man, the one slumped beneath the shadow of the vehicle, was not fully unconscious, but neither was he lucid enough to recount anything with clarity. His eyes barely open, his chest rising and falling in uneven gasps, His lips murmured fragments of words that never formed complete thoughts. The officer crouched beside him, pulled out the radio, transmitted the locator code, requested immediate medical assistance, and asked for a deeper trace on the vehicle's registration. But then, when his eyes fell again upon the frayed rope, the bite marks, and the half-embedded tire impression etched into the slanted earth, he paused. Just for a beat. There was something familiar. He couldn't tell if it was the faint metallic scent of diluted blood or the formation of the attack. Calculated, precise, the kind that could only come from a pair of dogs trained to move as one. And then, quietly, so subtle it felt like a single note slipping into the seam of memory, he recalled a name buried at the end of a red-stamped personnel file left in the archives of a decommissioned outpost near the western border, a base that once housed K-9 units, officially closed at the beginning of the last dry season. No handlers returned to claim any animals, just a line in a final report mentioning 2 canines discharged without reassignment. No new agency took them in. One bore an ear tag with the identifier, AEG-07. The other had no formal name, but was noted during training as Soul, the last flicker of light that still reacted in the dark. The officer looked toward the horizon, where dust still drifted gently against the wind's pull. He saw nothing. No silhouettes, no tire tracks stretching into the distance, no trail of blood smeared across the sand. And yet, rising within him was something remarkably close to reverence. Not for a mission well executed, not for a perfect takedown, but for a choice, made by beings no longer bound by rank or insignia, yet still carrying within them the unshaken discipline once forged through wind, grit, and a promise that had never truly faded. Wind teased across the edges of the ashen stone, carrying with it a fine dust sculpted from countless days of sun, baking the topsoil into new layers of skin for this ancient land. The officer leaned back lightly against the edge of the vehicle's door, his gaze fixed on the west, where the horizon blurred like charcoal smudged beneath an open palm, slowly disappearing into silence. He had called in the recovery team. He had transmitted the code. He had flagged the coordinates. But within him, what lingered was not the urgency of procedure, not the list of steps to complete, but the image no one would log. A horse and 2 dogs walking away without sound, leaving behind only faint arcs in the sand that no wind would ever fully erase. He opened his notebook, began to jot down preliminary notes on the scene. His pen hovered above the line. Canine bite marks, pressure sufficient to tear muscle, but shallow, not fatal. Beneath it, he added, lateral impact to vehicle body, force consistent, deliberate, applied from side. Taken alone, they were data points, but placed together they became something else, a signature pattern of coordination he had seen before, back in the borderlands, during specialized K-9 drills, near a base that hadn't been far from here. He didn't need a map. The layout of Bravo 9 was still carved into his mind, a station that once trained canine pairs under the split-hand model. 1 defensive unit, 1 mobile. Those dogs had no names at first, only numbers, and the code for the strongest defensive unit, male, scarred left ear, was AEG-07. He pulled out his phone, opened the low-level security access tool, entered the code AEG-07. The system returned a blank screen. No data, just one message, cold and absolute. File retired, access revoked, reason, operation closed. He tried the second. There was no formal ID, just a phrase he remembered flashing once in a printed report from a faulty terminal. Sol, light reactive response, right flank formation, handler unknown. Nothing returned. No archive, no buffer log. Only a blinking white bar, pulsing softly at the bottom of the screen, like the final flicker of memory from a system that had once held the names of beings no longer spoken aloud. He exhaled. It wasn't a heavy breath, not long, but it carried something that no longer belonged to duty. He folded the notebook, looked down at his hand, the same hand that had once signed the papers surrendering Bravo 9 to demolition crews. That day, the flags had been lowered, the signs unbolted, the insignias painted over. What remained were broken fences, rusted water stations, and rows of empty kennels echoing with silence. No one had come to retrieve the final dogs. No inquiry ever followed their disappearance from the final morning drill. And now, standing in the desert, where silence stretched longer than any report, he spoke, just loud enough for himself to hear, not for the wind to carry. They don't belong to anyone anymore. He didn't add anything, didn't upload a record, didn't mark the map. He simply closed the phone, climbed into the vehicle, and turned the wheel the opposite direction. The patrol car moved off slowly. No siren, no spotlight sweep, leaving behind an intentional emptiness, a quiet corridor for three beings who had already chosen their own road forward. The noonday light spilled outward like thinned ink across a crumpled sky, stretching from the glowing eastern dunes to the scorched, darker soil in the west, where the trail no longer had edges, only the steady press of footsteps etched into each grain of earth, shadows drawn out like the remaining breath of a journey still unnamed. Aegis led, his pace unhurried but unwavering, a silent anchor that never broke stride. Sewell followed behind, occasionally veering left or right with each cross-current of wind, his body attuned to every subtle depression, every swirl of suspended dust, as if even the tiniest movement of sand might carry a message worth decoding. Spirit moved in the center, not trembling anymore, but placing each step with care that outweighed the actual weight of his body. Every footfall was a choice, not to flee, not to arrive, but simply to continue. The dried blood on his underside had stiffened into brittle patches. The old rope marks around his neck were still visible, etched like fractures in stone, but they no longer hurt. His breathing had steadied. His ears now flicked upward whenever the wind changed direction, and sometimes, in just the briefest flickers, his eyes no longer swam in haze, but glinted instead with something silver, something quiet, something very much like hope. Until, on the 206th step across a slope of fractured stone, midway through a narrow pass that curved along the northern edge of the sandbank, a sharp, slanted shard caught the edge of his front left hoof. The sound it made was nearly inaudible, a brittle snap, like wire breaking beneath snow. Spirit staggered, his body listing hard to one side, his eyes wide with pain but silent, his left knee pulling in, the leg lifting off the ground in a trembling arc, as if a piece of a memory he'd just recovered had been sliced away. Aegis turned immediately, one movement, no hesitation. He didn't speak. He didn't rush. He didn't press forward too fast. He just stood where Spirit could see him, close enough for the horse to lock onto his eyes, far enough not to make the pain feel like weakness. Sewell didn't wait for orders. He had already shifted left, brushing past the low grasses and thickening sand, nose to the ground, searching along the exposed root clusters for the delicate, soft-stemmed plants once used in field stations to pack wounds when there was no time for bandages. He knew what to look for. They all did. Because even now, without a base, without a command, something in their training had never left. The instinct to respond, the readiness to protect. And the bond, once formed in silence, that needed no words to endure. Spirit lowered his hoof, just slightly, and blood welled out from beneath the rim, dark and thick like aged wine, sinking into the sand and blooming in a circle that spread quickly, like a raindrop falling onto cloth. He lifted his head, not to leave, not in fear, but as though to search inward, to ask if he still had enough strength left to remain standing. His ears still listened to the wind, His eyes stayed open, and his breathing, though heavier, remained steady. Aegis stepped forward, half a step only. He did not touch. He simply bowed his head, nose brushing the edge of blood before gently nudging the sand aside, as though clearing a space clean enough for the next step to be made. The wind shifted. The scent of blood lifted, faint, not foul, carrying with it something remembered, something private, something that brought Aegis back to the first time he had torn his own skin to escape the restraints during the final drill before the base was disbanded. Sol returned then, carrying in his mouth a small clump of grass, yellowing, tipped green, not much, but supple, soft. He placed it gently beside Spirit's hoof, nudging it with his nose into a neat bundle, then tilted his body and pressed his side lightly against the wound, letting the threads of grass catch the fresh blood like a mend on a wind-worn cloak. He didn't lick. He didn't snarl. He only exhaled, warm breath rising over the wound in soft gusts like quiet sentences without language, saying, "A wound is not a reason to stop. It's proof you still feel the road beneath you." Spirit tilted his head, eyes meeting Aegis's, and between those two gazes, a space opened, unspoken, unnamed, yet wide enough to carry a single decision that had already been made. No one turns back. No one is left behind. The blood still seeped, but slower now. The grass, pressed in place, held on to its green around its gold like trust mixed with doubt. And when the wind caught a few dry blades, lifted them briefly into the air, let them spin and fall back beside the hoof. The three of them stood exactly as they had before, not changed in position, but altered in knowing. That the journey was not defined by its distance, but by how they moved through each quiet pain, close enough, true enough, enduring enough to not be lost to the wind. The sand began to shift direction, first in faint diagonal flicks against the ground, then thickening rapidly into streaks of blinding dust, curling in mid-air like vast torn ribbons dragged by unseen hands. Sol sensed it first. He turned, eyes narrowing toward the low clouds beginning to twist on the horizon, then bolted ahead without a sound, leaving behind only sharp, urgent tracks pressed into the sand, a language of warning meant only for Aegis. Aegis turned his head. Spirit still followed, his gait limping, but unwavering. The blood had dried. The grass, pressed by wind and time, had hardened into a brittle cushion still clinging in place. Seeing Sol's footprints, Aegis asked no questions. He simply changed direction. Spirit followed closely. No sound, no protest, head lowered, not in defeat, but with the instinct of one who has lived too near uncertainty to require new reasons for caution. Sol led them to a rusted metal hut, half hidden behind a crumbled brick wall just taller than a man's height, leaning as if it had once tried to remember what it was, but forgot halfway. An old electrical station. Its roof collapsed in places, but the structural frame remained. One door had been torn from its hinge by wind long past, now resting against a dry shrub. The air was thick with the scent of rust, trapped moisture, and ancient wind tangled in wire mesh. None of it safe, but just enough to earn the word shelter when the sky began to raise its voice. The wind rose, sand lashed sideways like a whip. The little hut trembled as golden waves screamed outside. Spirit lay first, his head pressed to the cracked concrete floor, eyes half open, just enough to watch the last sliver of light filtering through a gap in the wall. Sol positioned himself beside the door, back turned outward, eyes unblinking, posture crossed in that silent, timeless stance known only to true sentinels. Aegis remained standing, neither seated nor resting, breathing quietly, his nose lifted, eyes staring not at anything in the hut, but through the warped steel above, as if watching something not yet arrived, something not bound to the present. Through the storm's howl came a voice, not in sound, but from memory's deepest echo. "Hold position. No retreat. No movement unless ordered." The voice was deep, clear, once used to train dozens, maybe hundreds of dogs across the camp. That voice, on one last morning before winter's end, had spoken those words to Aegis, just as the collar was removed from his neck for the final time, just as the base's gate opened for a transfer no one waited to receive. Aegis remembered the gate's color, dull silver gray, the sign Bravo 9 removed, leaving behind only pale welding scars like ghosts of purpose. He had stood there, waiting for the next command, for the familiar hand to tap gently on his left shoulder as it always had at the end of drills. But that hand never came. The gate closed, from the inside. And from that moment forward, no orders were ever spoken to him again. No one called his name. No new command was issued. Only the void remained. And in that void, instinct began seeking signals. Finding none, Aegis lifted his head. Hearing nothing, he turned back. Touching no one, he stepped forward. And that step, with no command, no assigned destination, was the moment Aegis departed from the category of the trained. From that second on, every movement was his choice, every turn of his head a decision. And the silence inside him began to take shape, not as emptiness, but as a permanent directive. Choose your own path, but never leave anyone behind. The wind shrieked louder outside. Sand spiraled and struck the hut's roof, ringing out with the sound of metal scraping metal in the middle of a desert storm. But inside that small shelter, Aegis moved toward Spirit, lay down beside him. Not touching, just sinking his breath. Sewell shifted his position, never leaving the doorway, only angling himself so he could see both the inside and the world beyond. The storm outside roared, as if trying to lift the entire forgotten land from its foundation. But the three living bodies within, one horse, two dogs, remained where they were, unmoved, as if no storm, no memory, no sky had the right to dictate their next step. Only one truth rang louder than the wind. This was no longer a place of commands. And precisely because of that, it had become a place of real choices. That night, the sky bore no stars, no clouds, just a vast, deep blue canopy stretched taut across the world like velvet laid gently over the edges of silence, wide enough to cradle an entire desert, and dense enough that every sound seemed to dissolve into it, swallowed by a stillness thick as dark water resting at the bottom of a forgotten lake. It was not cold. No wind stirred. There were no shadows trailing behind them, no scent of pursuit in the air. And yet Aegis did not close his eyes. He lay on his side, back turned toward the faintest wind drifting across the basin, as if shielding the other two bodies from even the smallest disturbance of the night. His eyes remained open. Not fully, but enough to see each steady rise and fall of Sewell's breathing to his left, and the subtle expansion of Spirit's chest to his right. Lying slightly tilted, head to the earth, one ear resting as if caught mid-listen, like a dried leaf suspended in air that had yet to decide whether it should fall. Sewell wasn't asleep either. He curled himself into a position that once belonged to sentries resting between shifts. Head laid against his front legs, ears angled low, tail tucked along the edge of the sand, the whole body drawn like a bow that had never fully relaxed. His eyes, half-lidded, drifted first toward Aegis's back, then flicked to Spirit's eyes, where a quiet, unblinking gaze pierced the dark beyond the horizon, watching a place where, if one stared long enough, one could almost imagine a path. Unreal, intangible, but strangely worth believing in. Spirit breathed slowly, not in the stuttered rhythm of captivity, nor the labored gasp of post-storm fatigue. It was the breathing of something that had touched a peace too gentle to be trusted, too whole to feel real. He didn't close his eyes, didn't glance away, just held his gaze in one direction toward the east, toward the place where morning would eventually rise, as if by keeping his focus there long enough, he might anchor the moment into permanence, might delay its passing by simply watching it exist. No one spoke, no signals were given, no barks, no whinnies, only 3 living beings, one dog who had once stood as a shield, one dog who had once been the last glimmer in a training field long forgotten, and one young horse who had been left behind in the dust, now lay beside one another, not to sleep, but to test a question too fragile to ask aloud. If peace is real, can it last long enough for someone to breathe into it? The wind did not stir the leaves. Only the soft hush of sand brushing sand remained, the sound faint as cloth grazing skin, not enough to alarm, but not soft enough to invite surrender. Aegis exhaled once, his neck tilting ever so slightly, as if checking whether Sul had finally drifted off. Sul's eyes had closed, but one ear still angled back, a kind of sleep practiced only to preserve darkness, not to leave the moment behind. Spirit kept watching. No shift in posture, no head pressed into warmth, only the quiet shortening of breath, not from fatigue, but from a heartbeat that seemed afraid of racing, as if every moment before this had been only a prologue to now. A moment with no rope, no command, no chase, no demand. And because of that, it felt impossibly delicate. A single dry leaf fell from a nearby bush, spiraled once, then touched down on Sul's back. He didn't move. Aegis glanced over, softly, like the cast of a moon without a halo. Spirit blinked, for the first time, a single close, then open. Perhaps it was reflex, or a test, a way to confirm, am I still awake, or has this become the dream I feared to want? And so the night passed, like a film slowed to its final frame, where nothing moved forward and nothing returned, where every shift, every twitch, was a vibration shared across 3 living bodies too afraid to sleep, because the most beautiful things are often the first to vanish when our eyes are closed. The light of dawn spilled gently across the ground, golden and soft, so tender that even the wind moved slower, as if unwilling to disturb the delicate skin just laid over the desert's bones after a long day of silence. Far off, stretched across the rim of the horizon, was a strange band of green. Not the dusky green of desert brush, not the gray-tinged brown of dried moss or sun-worn leaves, but the deep, living hue of grass that had been planted, watered, sustained by hands that meant for it to live. Spirit lifted his head first, his nostrils widened, breath thickening, not in panic, but in the kind of pulse one feels when hope enters too quickly, before the body is ready to carry it. The smell of clean water, of young grass, of air that no longer carried dust. Sul slowed his steps, watching each subtle change in Spirit's gait. He didn't turn toward the green immediately, only observed. And when he saw Spirit's direction begin to arc away from the original line, he moved to intercept. Not to stop him, only to guide, circling gently in front of the horse's path, holding just close enough to suggest caution without resistance. Aegis halted. One ear twitched. The wind had shifted from the compound, and within it came a scent not everyone would recognize. But for a dog trained in military grounds, it was unmistakable, as clear as blood against snow, the smell of fresh paint, of oiled leather, of rope recently cut, of confinement buried beneath sunlight and grass. Spirit still moved toward it. Not running, not driven. More like drawn, by something primitive, something promised but not proven. Beyond a short wall of brush, an open gate revealed the facility. A horse rescue camp. Rows of whitewashed wooden stalls, gleaming troughs catching the light, bales of green hay spread like rugs so lush they begged for weight. A man stood within, not stepping forward, not calling out. He simply stood, watching. An older man, not stern, not unfamiliar. And in the way he didn't assert himself, didn't beckon, Aegis felt something he didn't expect. He tilted his head, stretched his neck, sniffed once, and then shifted his weight onto his back legs. His eyes met Sewell's. No signal was given, but something ancient passed between them. Sewell took a step forward, nudging up to Spirit's flank, his nose pressing lightly against the horse's rear knee. Spirit stopped, but his eyes did not turn away. He panted, not from fatigue, but from being split cleanly between yearning and vigilance. Aegis broke formation. He moved around, not straight toward the camp, but along its outer edge. His gaze never left the fence line, especially the fine steel wires camouflaged to match the grass. Inside the enclosure, he saw old hoof prints, deep, not faint, trailing in lines that didn't end, as if someone had once tried to leave. Not once. Not one. The trough smelled too clean. The grass bore no tread. The light inside the paddocks held no moving silhouettes. Everything lay arranged like a perfect performance of peace, but there was no sound. Aegis turned. He didn't bark, he just shook his neck once. Sewell bent his legs, pressed down, launched forward toward the fence, not biting, but digging just beneath the lowest timber rail, snapping it loose from its base. Aegis dropped his weight low, wedged his shoulder, and shoved against the angled iron bar. The crack that followed wasn't loud, but it was enough. Enough to make every eye nearby turn. Spirit startled, not violently, but as if something deep within had been stirred awake. The man inside took a step forward, slowly, one hand raised in a gesture meant to soothe, but Aegis had already stepped between them, silent and immovable. Sewell growled, not as a threat, but as the drawing of a boundary, and in that moment when it seemed all motion might freeze, Spirit turned. No hesitation, no internal struggle, and began to run. He cleared the fence as if it had never existed, as though borders meant nothing to something that had already crossed the farthest edge of obedience. He passed Aegis in a breath, ran alongside Sewell, then matched their pace, not speeding ahead, not lagging behind, just enough for the three of them to leave the cultivated grass behind as one. And in the final light before sunset, when sand began to cling again to hooves, to fur, to the thinning veil of air, Spirit did not look back, not because he feared being reclaimed, but because, for the first time, he had chosen. Not to survive, but to go forward with those who would never hold him down, yet would never let him walk alone. The moon poured across the slope like a hastily drawn silver cloth draped over a jagged earth, neither smooth nor soft, but lit just enough to expose every fracture, every block of stone teetering on the rim of a canyon still absent from maps. There was no trail, no signposts, only the shifting lines of wind threading between rocks, whispering in tones thin and cold, like the size of ancient ground that had carried many footprints, yet never managed to hold anyone's heart. Aegis led, his body tilting slightly to the left for balance, each step deliberate, not rushed. The incline sloped one way, the drop yawning close on the other side. Not as deep as a mountain's edge, but enough that should one fall, no call for help would rise fast enough to matter. Sewell followed in the rear, head low, weaving diagonally across narrow fissures, his paws skimming for tremors in the stone, as if the earth itself could speak, if only someone stayed still long enough to listen. Spirit moved between them, his hooves pressed down with intent, his head held high, but his ears folded back, not out of fear, but to shield from the wind, The night wind at this altitude carried a dry, biting chill, like salt that hadn't dissolved, slapping across the face, not hard enough to wound, but sharp enough to force each breath to be measured. Beneath his hooves, loose veins of rock shifted, not cracking, but sliding in slow shears, like stray thoughts sliding out of control. And then, in the pause between two thoughts, Spirit's front right hoof landed on a flat stone that rolled beneath him, slipping forward with the weight of his body, dragging him toward the edge. Gravity took hold before fear could. His whole form tipped, rear hooves losing purchase. A sharp exhale escaped his lungs. Not a whinny, not a cry, just a breath expelled by pure reflex as his body began to fall. But Aegis had already turned before the first pebble hit the abyss. He launched backward, his body reacting like muscle guided by memory, not calculation, driven by one absolute. The horse must not fall. And in the fraction of a second, barely enough time for a single leaf to fall from the upper ridge to the one below, his jaws had closed around Spirit's mane, just below the left side of the neck, not biting down, not wounding, but holding with enough force to halt the head's descent. Rocks and sand cascaded below like floodwater. Spirit flailed, front legs scrambling for solid ground, his body pulled taut like a bowstring stretched too far, sweat and dust streaking down his neck and chest. Sewell shot forward, no barking, no panic, just a shift of his body, pushing his full weight against Spirit's shoulder, providing a second axis of resistance from below. Aegis's hold could not overpower gravity, but in that grip was something stronger than mass, an insistence so resolute that for one brief instant the world itself paused. His front paw slipped, then found a crack, wedging just deep enough to anchor, and at that moment a sharp edge tore through the skin above his toe, drawing a thin stream of blood that ran down like diluted ink, soaking into the dusted rock beneath moonlight. Still, Aegis did not move back. His eyes did not blink. His breath came hard but stayed rhythmic. He tightened his jaw just slightly, enough for Spirit to know. He would not let go. Spirit lunged again, one hoof finding solid ground, and with a final heave from Sewell, the horse pulled free of the ledge, their three bodies collapsing together into a patch of wild, dry grass clinging like punctuation to the slope. Soft, sparse, and quietly victorious. None of them spoke. Aegis released his grip slowly, tongue sliding across his teeth to catch the blood still flowing, though shallow. Spirit dropped his head, trembling slightly, not from fear, but from being held when he had believed there was nothing left to grasp. Sewell pressed against his flank, back against Spirit's side, eyes locked on Aegis, as if to say, with the calm certainty of the bonded. That wasn't instinct. It was the kind of vow you make only once and live the rest of your life defending. And on that rock face, beneath the muted silver of moon and the quiet breath of the mountain wind, a streak of blood remained, not mortal, not dramatic, but enough to tell the story that once a dog did not look away when his companion began to fall. And Aegis's eyes, unchanged, unshaken, still faced forward, fixed on the path that had not yet ended. Night poured down like ink from a shattered inkwell, spreading into each crack of stone, each grain of land, each surviving stalk of grass, still holding on to the final hues of a sunset already surrendered. There was no wind, no insects, only a silence rough as untouched sand, coating every brittle root, every shadowed rock. This was the in-between, where day was no longer day, and night was not yet night. They stopped beneath the skeleton of a scorched tree, its trunk black as coal, yet still upright, as if refusing to fall. Spirit lay down first, legs folded beneath, eyes open, tired but no longer wary. Aegis settled beside him, his form shadowing half of Spirit's chest, head bowed like a statue carved from endurance. Sewell did not lie. He stood farther off, 3 paces out, facing the direction from which every sign now whispered. Something is coming. And then, footsteps, not loud, not even, not rushed, like hesitation made physical. The air shifted, thin tendrils of scent snaking past the rocks. A faint tang, matted fur, jagged teeth, the hollowness of stomachs long trained to detect a breath still warm. The hyenas had arrived, not in numbers that overwhelmed, but in enough to make any solitary creature reconsider its place in the night. They came not for hunger, but because stillness in their territory was a foreign thing. Sewell didn't retreat. He didn't advance. He simply stood, neither braced nor tense, like a branch refusing to shed its last leaf, though the storm had begun to howl. His eyes remained open, unfocused, yet firm, not staring any one of them down, but not surrendering to any stare in return. The first pair of eyes flashed in the dark, caught in a shard of moonlight, glowing with a ruddy amber hue, locked onto Sewell's but found none of the familiar flinch. The second hyena circled in from the side, head lifted, body tilted in that disjointed, unnerving gait that always seemed ready to hurl itself at whatever weakness appeared first. Sewell still stood there, neither whimpering, nor barking, nor growling. His eyes, dark, still, and deep, mirrored nothing but the reflection of those who dared to look into them, like the surface of a stone-bound lake that offered no distortion, no invitation, only the silent return of a gaze. The hyenas slowed, their steps suddenly unsure, their postures wavered. One took half a step forward, lowering its nose to the earth, but the moment its eyes met Sewell's, not a look of threat nor one of fear, it stopped, then stepped back. Another lifted a paw, suspended in mid-air, only to place it exactly where it had been. No commands were given, no roars signaled retreat. But something older than language, older than noise, rose from the space between breath and muscle, a message carved into the marrow of all creatures. I am not prey. I am not your challenger. But if you cross this line, the night will change its color. And so they turned, one by one, step by step, pulling back, not with panic, not with haste, but with the swaying withdrawal of silhouettes fading into the dark like smoke caught in reverse wind, dissolving, not disappearing. Sewell remained motionless until every sound of the pack had faded, until all that lingered was the quiet breath of Spirit and the slow, even rise of Aegis's chest. He returned, not to explain, not to be acknowledged, but to lie down beside Spirit, shoulder to flank, his head resting lightly across Aegis's leg, as if that exact position was all the answer needed for a night that bore no clash but preserved its wholeness through the quiet strength of stillness. And in that night, a night without a single snarl, what was affirmed was not who was strongest, but who could stand without trembling, who could hold a gaze without looking away, and who could maintain peace even as the darkness drew near. The morning sky unfolded like an unsealed letter, layers of thin cloud gently retreating at the touch of sunlight, pulling back, dissolving into a pale blue expanse, soft as a promise not yet spoken. Night's moisture clung to the fresh grass, scattering beams of early light like thousands of tiny mirrors spread across the land, sparkling, calm, never glaring, like dreams arriving only when one is tired enough to stop chasing them. They reached the edge of the meadow while the sun was still incomplete, and the wind still carried the chill of highland stone. Ahead, there were no fences, no gates, no signs to say someone had once entered or ever been kept out. only open space stretching toward a horizon where the green of the earth blended seamlessly into the blue of the sky. No boundary, no seam, no way to tell where one world ended and another began. Aegis was the first to stop. His paws left prints at the boundary where dust faded into dew, half clinging to desert, half resting on soft grass. His ears folded slightly, not from caution, but from listening. Not for sound, not for wind, but for that subtle, resonant pulse beneath the surface of the ground, a rhythm only those who had walked long enough through barren places could recognize. This is a land that requires no defense. Sol moved up on the right, lowered himself, tilted his head slightly, his nose brushing the first blades of grass before lifting again. Not in search of anything, but to affirm his presence, to tell the earth I am here. His gaze swept the meadow, not locking on anything but leaving behind a hush in its wake, as if every stalk of grass had received a glance, and every droplet of dew had recorded a breath. Spirit stood between the two, neither surging forward nor falling behind. He looked into the meadow as one looks into a mirror lake, where stepping in means watching everything once abandoned rise again in concentric ripples. His neck extended, ears lifted, and eyes no longer flicked or flinched. That gaze no longer asked, "May I?" It simply said, "I'm ready." No one gave a signal. No head nodded. There was no leash, no voice called, no gate opened, no marching order echoed. But Spirit turned. His eyes met Aegis's, in a moment so brief it could be mistaken for wind, and then he turned back and stepped forward. Not tentative, not testing, but a full step, grounded and decisive, like a heartbeat thudding into a chest the moment one realizes, this is freedom. His hoof landed on the first patch of grass. The crunch barely audible, but it reached straight into the hearts of the two dogs who stood behind him. Sol tilted his head. Aegis raised his eyes. And then, without a word exchanged, they followed, each on opposite sides, not to lead, not to catch up, but to walk in parallel, two silent currents beside one soul crossing the invisible border between what once was and what might now be. There was no flag, no inscription, no marker to declare this land safe. But as the three bodies, one horse, two dogs, cast shadows upon the gentle field, and the sunlight began to spill across their shoulders, their backs, their dew-dampened fur, it became clear to anyone watching. Some places, by virtue of having no walls, are exactly what we mean when we say home. The day moved across the meadow like a silk ribbon slowly unfurling from the highest tier of the sky, not falling fast, not coiling tightly, but drifting, settling into each patch of grass, each soft depression in the soil, each breath of wind exhaled gently through low tree limbs in the distance. The sun did not blaze, did not press, almost as if it too understood that this was not the time to expose everything, but the moment to let silence speak. Aegis rose while the sun still lingered on the eastern rim, his stance steady, neither advancing nor retreating, just a figure of breath and bone that knew how to listen, how to anchor, and how to keep the world intact through the sheer gravity of being. He said nothing. He didn't need to, for his very presence whispered the message clear enough. All is well. I am still here. Sol did not look at Aegis, but every step he took revolved subtly around him, like wind circling a standing stone, never eroding, but always nearby. He moved along the edge of the field, marking a few blades with his familiar scent, then returned to Spirit's side, not touching, not sniffing, simply lying down within a distance close enough that, should either one stir, they would not collide, yet they would still know the other was near. Still there, still real. Spirit stood for a long while beside the water, head unbowed, hooves still, his body unmoving not out of hesitation, but as if he were waiting for a sign that could not be spoken. something beneath the surface that would tell him it was safe not to fear. And then, without command, without coaxing, he lowered his head and drank, sip by quiet sip, not out of thirst, not with caution, but simply as an act of being, as something the body chooses when the heart is no longer bound tight by doubt. The day passed like that. No barking, no neighing, no growling, no orders exchanged. No sound rose to mark presence, and yet every step found its place, every gaze held direction. Each breath pulsed in harmony with a quiet community not built upon commands, but upon understanding, an unspoken knowing of who stood where, who held what, and who was the anchor to whom. Aegis sat on the rise of a sun-warmed hillock, gazing westward, toward a horizon still too distant to claim, "We've arrived." But his gaze did not search, nor did it wait. His eyes, calm as deep water, mirrored two figures below, one horse standing, one dog at rest, yet saw them with a clarity as though the earth itself had decided to preserve his sight, to not let the image drift away. Sol lay on his side, head resting atop his front legs, eyes half-lidded, but his ears continued to turn, left and right, like antennae tuned to signals no one else could hear, intercepting messages from a network that had never needed language. Spirit passed by him, not pausing, but slowing, just by half a step, as his eyes drifted sideways for only a second, and with a single breath sent out a greeting that required no sound, only this understanding left in the air. "I see you there, and I know. I am not alone." No birds crossed the sky, no snakes stirred the grass. There was no danger, no disruption, and yet, within that peace, something deeper began to tie itself together, thread by thread, breath by breath, not through words or calls, but through a language long past the need for syllables, the language of position, of attention, of how one being can exist beside another without making its presence feel like a question. And when the sun dipped low and the last gold was drawn from the final blade of grass, the three bodies remained in their places, unchanged in distance, but drawn close by something that required no translation. Trust. Morning returned like a song without lyrics, spilling softly across the land, each beam of light separating mist like gentle fingers combing through the tangled hair of grass bowed under a cold night. The warmth slid into every quiet space between the still bodies, not because they were weary, but because none of them wanted to wake too soon what had just reached completion. Spirit rose first, not with a yawn, not with a stretch, just a single, round, and truthful motion, as if the field itself had stirred his bones with a subterranean pulse. His gaze did not lift to the sky, nor to the endless road, but aimed straight toward Aegis, where the familiar shape of a steady figure cast a shadow over dark soil, anchored like a beginning waiting to be chosen again. Aegis did not rise. He sat still, shoulders tilted, eyes unblinking, not out of surprise, but because he had already known, through no prophecy, only through the intuition of one who had lost too much, not to recognize the moment something would stay. Sul said nothing. He remained low to the ground, silent, but his gaze traveled the length of Spirit's body, not to pull him close, not to create space, but simply to say, "That choice is yours, and we are here if you return." Spirit stepped toward Aegis, not fast, not slow, but steady, sure-footed, each step pressed into damp soil like the earth itself had decided to hold his choice and not let it fall. The distance closed, and in a moment that needed no sound, no gesture, the horse tilted his head slightly left, pressing his cheek to Aegis's neck, not to lean, not to rest, but to deliver a message wordless and full. "I choose you." Aegis did not move, but his body, at the shoulder, the neck, the thigh, softened just a little, like a taut rope finally released, not breaking, not recoiling, only learning to breathe again. No one stepped forward to tether Spirit. No rope was thrown around his neck. No praise was offered. No hand reached to reward. But in the quiet place where the sun rose slowly, gently enough to touch all three bodies in equal light, something was confirmed, something larger than language, beyond all concepts of ownership or loyalty. Soul stood, walked to Spirit's side, and touched his chest with the top of his head, not for long, not hard, but as a greeting between companions who had gone far enough together to never need another word. A flock of birds winged overhead, casting streaks of shadow that slid across the grass like signatures the sky had chosen to sign this moment with. And when the three of them looked out across the open plain, not seeking a path, not chasing a goal, but simply to continue, then that land, that wind, those steps became their map. Loyalty doesn't need to be taught. It only needs to be freely chosen. There are journeys that do not begin with a clear destination, and that never end with a marked finish line. There are paths, like that of Aegis, Soul, and Spirit, that are drawn only as each footfall lands, painted in lines of sincerity, courage, and the quiet freedom of a soul choosing for itself. We often ask, where are we going? But sometimes, what matters most lies in the silent seconds we stop beside someone with no reason but the desire to stay, in the way we protect another life without needing permission, in the kind of silence deep enough to carry meaning without speech. The goal may shift, the ending may blur, but the peace that comes from knowing you are exactly where you should be, where the soul no longer has to brace, but is free to simply be, that is the treasure worth keeping. This journey needs no recognition. It only needs to feel enough. And when it feels enough, we begin to love with less armor, more tenderness, more truth. We stop waiting for someone to fall before we offer a hand. We stop waiting for someone to call before we turn back. Because we understand, a single look can be salvation. A step beside someone can be a promise. So love more. Care more. Not because anyone asks you to, but because in every breath, your own and those of the beings you meet by chance on this path, there is always a whisper. True freedom begins with the kindness we give without asking anything in return. And that is home. A home that needs no walls, only to be felt in the heart. One quiet morning in the forest, an old German shepherd stood guard beside a trembling fawn. No words, no commands, just presence, and somehow that was enough to save a life. They weren't the same species, didn't speak the same language, but their bond grew like family, until one gunshot shattered everything, and nothing was ever the same again. Can the friendship between a dog and a deer survive the wild's harshest truth? What happens next will stay with you long after the story ends. You know how some places just feel quieter than they should be? Like the air itself is holding its breath? That's what March evenings in Sewanee were like. Even before the sun dipped behind the pine trees, the light would start to fade. It didn't disappear. It thinned, like mist brushing over the tops of tired trees, settling on the riverbank like a memory no one asked for. The Sewanee River used to rush wild and fast, chattering over pale stones, echoing against the cliffs. But not anymore. Now it looked cracked and dry, like the skin of an old man who's lived too long. The riverbed was a patchwork of brittle mud and forgotten rocks, jutting up like broken teeth. It was along that road, kicking up little puffs of dust, that an old gray pickup rumbled forward. The engine gave a tired cough. Inside, Caleb Weiler sat behind the wheel, eyes fixed ahead. Beside him, curled up like he always was, lay Alden, his German shepherd. 8 years they'd had each other. 8 years of quiet mornings and broken days. Alden's ears twitched with every snap of a twig beneath the tires, but his eyes stayed half shut, his head resting gently on Caleb's leg. That was how they always rode shoulder to shoulder, not as man and dog, as something quieter, something more human than most people could explain. Caleb's house sat alone at the top of a low hill, 4 miles outside the town. No neighbors, no streetlights, just wind, pine trees, and the sound of rain ticking against a tin roof whenever night came down hard. He hadn't always lived like this. There was a time when Caleb built homes, raised a child, kissed someone goodnight. That was before the storm, before the fire, before everything turned to ash. Since then, he'd let the world go on without him, let it forget. All he kept was Alden. And in the evenings, when the sky wasn't crying, Caleb would drive along the river. No reason, no destination. Sometimes just to smoke a cigarette and feel what silence felt like. Sometimes to listen to the same old tapes crackling through a radio that hadn't been replaced in 20 years. Old songs that sounded like they were coming from behind a closed door in the past. Alden always came along. No leash, no commands. It was understood if one got in the truck, the other followed. Simple as that. That evening, Caleb slowed to a stop near a bend where the river still held a little water. He let the engine hum for a second, then rolled the window halfway down. A breeze drifted in. Damp, muddy. It carried the smell of wet roots and buried things. He lit a cigarette. The tip glowed orange for a moment. The flame crackled. And that's when Alden moved. Not just stirred, moved. Fast. In a blink, Alden was up, body tense, ears pinned forward, staring ahead like he saw something no one else could. Then, that low growl. Deep. Controlled. Not loud, but enough to make Caleb turn, his heart skipping just once. "What is it, boy?" he asked, but Alden wasn't listening. He had both front paws on the truck door now, nose tilted toward the water, breathing like he was chasing something only he could sense. Caleb sat up straighter, looked where Alden was looking. The river was still. Cold and gray. Same as always. But Alden wasn't the same. It was like something invisible had grabbed hold of him, something ancient, something urgent. Caleb stubbed the cigarette out in the tray, following Alden's line of sight with his own. And there, at the far end of the river bend, where the water still pooled deep in a quiet pocket, something moved. Just a ripple, a shift in shadow. Then a gust of wind swept over the rocks, sharp and sudden, and for a breathless moment, everything stopped. No birds, no tires crunching gravel, only the soft trickle of water. And something else. Something that sounded almost like a voice. Calling. Faint, but real. Like the river itself was whispering. Like something down there was waiting. And Alden, he heard it first. It was barely a sound. Small. Almost not there. But it was enough to stop Alden in his tracks. A sound like that doesn't come from the wind. It doesn't come from birds or trees. It comes from something lost, something scared, something holding on by a thread. It slipped through the silence like a whisper wrapped in water. Wet, shaky, and fading. Like a breath that didn't know if it wanted to keep going. It was the kind of sound that slips into the back of your mind and makes everything still. Alden surged forward, both paws hammering the door. His nails scraped against the window in frantic beats, each one sharper than the last. His eyes were wide, locked in. No calm, no hesitation. Just something raw, something urgent. Caleb opened the door without thinking. Alden was already gone. He hit the ground running, nose stretched toward the river, letting out a low, tense growl. It wasn't loud, but it carried weight. It sounded like the kind of warning that comes when time is almost out. Caleb stood frozen. The river in front of him wasn't just a river anymore. It was a wound. That same spot, that same bend in the water, that same gray sky. It all came back, a piece of the past, cracking open in real time. And in that moment, he didn't see Alden. He saw his son. That look, those eyes, that soft, desperate cry. It had happened here, years ago, same time of day, same broken sound. Back then, Caleb had moved too slow, just a few seconds too slow, and by the time he reached the edge, the boy was gone, pulled under by something no one could fight. Not then, not now. Alden growled again. Louder. Then he ran. His paws slammed against the ground, kicking up dust and broken pebbles as he darted toward the edge. Caleb flinched, called after him, voice hoarse, barely holding together, but Alden didn't stop. He leapt straight off the rocks and into the water. The splash echoed like a crack of thunder in the quiet. Caleb ran forward, knees hitting the ground as he reached the bank. His chest tightened. The cold from the river seeped into his bones even from where he knelt. Alden surfaced fast, strong, focused. He scanned, found the spot, then swam. Each stroke steady. Sure, unshaken. And then Caleb saw it. Floating in the center of the river, spinning slowly, was something small, something barely moving, a patch of pale brown fur, legs curled inward, head tilted back toward the sky. No fight left, just drifting, like it had almost let go. Caleb clenched his fists. He didn't know what it was, that thing floating out there. An animal? A shadow? A trick of the light? But Alden's eyes never wavered. And that was all Caleb needed to understand. If he stood still now, if he waited even 1 second too long, something else would be lost. Again. He lowered his voice, steady but sharp. Alden, go. Just 3 words. Quick, precise, like a line between life and death. Alden looked back. Just for a heartbeat. Just long enough to say, I hear you. Then he launched himself forward, a clean, fierce leap. His nose broke through the surface like a blade, slicing into the muddy water like it was glass. The splash came hard, sudden. Ripples spread in tight circles, then faded into the swirl of the quiet current. Caleb ran to the edge, his hands slammed down against the cold stone, knees in wet sand, eyes locked on the water, tracking every shift and ring where Alden had gone under. His heart was pounding. His chest felt crushed from the inside, like something heavy had settled over it and refused to move. He didn't know what scared him more, that the small creature out there might already be dead, or that it might still be alive. Alden surfaced once. His back broke through the surface, eyes scanning, sensing. Then, without pause, he dove again. This time deeper. Longer. Caleb swallowed. His throat was dry, his breath stuck halfway. The air was thick. His mind, louder than the wind, was playing everything back, those old memories, unspooling like broken film. The river. That storm. His son's tiny hands flailing in the rain. The scream. The desperate splash. And those eyes wide open, never closing. A jolt beneath the surface. Something broke through. Alden rose from the water, mouth clamped gently around something small. A shape. Drenched. Limpio. Its fur was soaked through, thin limbs hanging like thread. The tiny body sagged, head tilted, motionless. Caleb couldn't tell what it was. A puppy? A kitten? Just a bag caught in the weeds? But Alden's eyes, sharp, locked in, unwavering, said everything. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't debris. This was someone. Alden kept the little creature's head lifted just above the waterline. The rest of its body dangled below the surface, hidden by the river's murky swirl. Alden's strokes slowed, now labored. His body pushed forward against the pull, steady but strained. It was like he was carrying breath itself, fragile, almost too light to hold. Caleb leaned in, hands bracing against his knees, wind cutting across the back of his neck. His ears were ringing. He couldn't hear the river anymore, couldn't feel the ground. Everything narrowed into that single moment, a dog swimming against the current, carrying something nameless toward him. Then suddenly a burst of motion. Water broke open in a sharp splash. Alden gave a strong kick, lifting his head and the tiny form higher above the surface. The creature was still limp, still shivering, still not moving. Caleb stopped breathing. Alden kept going, pushing closer. Stroke by stroke. Bringing it home. Bringing it back. Each movement sent ripples curling outward, soft rings melting into the dusk. The riverbank was slick and flooded now, the mud giving way beneath Caleb's boots, but he didn't care. He was already down, arms open, waiting. And then Alden was there. Close enough. Caleb reached forward, caught the tiny body as Alden rose up from the water, soaking and shaking. He laid the creature down on the wet grass, small, cold, completely limp. For a long second, Caleb just stared. Thin, matted fur, ribs poking out from under the skin, breath so shallow it barely moved the chest. It looked more like a shadow than something living, something lost too long, but it was breathing. Just barely. Then the last light of the day fell across its fur, just enough to catch on the delicate strands. And there they were, tiny white specks, scattered along the damp brown back like wildflowers pressed into the earth. It was a fawn, no bigger than a school backpack, eyes wide and glazed, ears trembling. Its entire body looked like it had been made from nothing but bones and skin. Caleb didn't think. He just moved. He tore off his heavy coat and draped it over the tiny form, hands trembling as he gently wiped its face, bit by bit. Then he slid his fingers under the hind legs and lifted, slowly, carefully, letting the water drain from its mouth and nose. A trickle of cold river water ran down the side of its cheek. Then its lips twitched. A tiny gasp cracked out. Then another. Thin, broken, like a thread trying to hold on to one last breath. Alden stayed close, silent. Not a bark, not a sound. He leaned in, nose brushing the little fawn's ear, then gave it one soft lick. Just one. His warm tongue swept gently over a patch of mud on its forehead. It wasn't something taught. It was instinct. It was knowing somehow that what mattered most in that moment wasn't strength. It was tenderness. Caleb sank to the ground, legs folded, eyes fixed on the bundle under his coat. Around them, the whole world had gone still. No breeze, no birds, not even the river moved. Only one thing stirred now his memory, because years ago, at this very riverbank, he had knelt the same way. He had cradled a small, cold body, pulled from the water just minutes too late. No breath, no sound, just a face, frozen in a question no one would ever answer. That was his son, Sam, 6 years old, wild curls and eyes that lit up every time he spoke about animals. Sam believed lost creatures were always waiting for someone kind enough to find them. That afternoon, they'd been walking this same stretch of river. Sam heard a noise near the reeds and darted ahead, said it was a baby squirrel, or maybe a fox. Caleb couldn't remember. Sam had shouted, "I'll name it Dottie." The spots on its back looked like the cookies Mom made. Then he'd taken off, tiny shoes sinking into the wet grass. Minutes later, Sam slipped into the water, and the world never felt whole again. Caleb had jumped in after him. He pulled Sam out, but it was too late. After that day, he stopped walking the riverbank when the water was high, and he never spoke the name Dottie again. Not once, not until now. The fawn let out a breath, not a cry, not a full sound, but something alive. Caleb leaned in, touched its forehead with one finger. It was ice cold, but it was alive. Alden settled beside them, tail brushing the dirt in a slow, thoughtful rhythm. His ears still pointed straight, eyes fixed on the little fawn's chest, watching each rise, each fall, quiet, present, as if he knew something had passed between the two small beings. Something invisible, but strong. Caleb tightened the coat gently around the fawn's body, then lifted it with both arms. So light, so terribly light. It felt like if he loosened his grip for even a second, the fawn might vanish into the wind. He stood slowly, met Alden's eyes, gave a small nod. "Let's go," he said. Alden turned, walking ahead toward the truck, and in that quiet moment Caleb knew. This wasn't just another March evening. Something had shifted. Something had come back. Something had begun. Caleb opened the truck door and reached behind the seat, pulling out an old blanket that smelled faintly of pine and dust. Gently, he laid the little fawn down, tucking his coat beneath it like a second layer of warmth. The creature didn't stir. It just breathed softly, barely. Each rise and fall of its chest was like a whisper, a thread pulled tight, clinging to life with everything it had left. Alden didn't leap into the truck like he usually did. Instead, he paused beside the open door, eyes on Caleb, waiting. Then, with quiet resolve, he stepped up onto the passenger seat. But he didn't lie down. He sat sideways, his entire body turned toward the back, toward the little life curled beneath the blanket. Caleb climbed into the driver's seat. The old engine coughed once before humming to life. Dashboard lights flickered gently. The radio crackled on like it always did, static. Then that familiar low voice. But Caleb turned the dial off before the song could begin. He didn't want music, not now. Not over this moment. The truck rolled forward, slow and steady, its tires humming against the dirt road that curved through the edge of the woods. Outside the window, white grasses swayed in the wind like soft brush strokes, painting the fading day. But inside the truck, the silence felt different now. It wasn't empty. It wasn't cold. Caleb glanced at the rearview mirror. The fawn was still there, tucked beneath the blanket, its tiny head tilted slightly to one side, resting against the folds of cloth. Beside it, Alden stayed perfectly still, not watching the road, not even glancing at Caleb, just keeping his eyes locked on the fragile figure in the back seat. It wasn't alertness. It was something else. Protection. Then, as the last of the evening light spilled through the back window, Caleb noticed something new. There, glowing faintly on the fawn's wet fur, were the white spots, tiny, round, and scattered like raindrops caught on morning leaves. So familiar, so heartbreakingly familiar. He swallowed hard. And without planning to, without thinking at all, he whispered it aloud. Dottie. The name just came out. No filter, no hesitation, just memory, wrapped in the shape of a word. But because it came from nowhere, it hit everywhere. It was a name that hadn't touched his lips in years, a name his son had once given with bright eyes and a sticky-fingered grin. Sam had been 6, all curls and crayons, and a heart too big for his little chest. One day, wandering this same riverbank, Sam had seen something rustling in the grass, A baby animal, maybe a squirrel, maybe something else. Caleb didn't remember clearly. But Sam did. Sam had crouched down, grinning, and said, "I'll name it Dottie, because its back has little white spots, just like the cookies Mom makes." That same evening, Sam slipped. Wet grass, a quick shout, a splash. By the time Caleb pulled him from the water, it was too late. And ever since that day, Caleb never named anything again. But now, saying Dottie again, even in a whisper, felt like pressing a hand against an old scar. Not sharp like pain, but tender, like something that never quite finished healing. In the front seat, Alden lifted his head slightly, just enough to look back through the mirror. His dark eyes found Caleb's just for a second, a quiet, knowing second. Caleb tightened his grip on the steering wheel, still silent, but he knew. This wasn't a coincidence. There was Alden always quiet, but always knowing more than he let on. There was Dottie, so small, so fragile, still holding on to breath like it was something worth fighting for. And then there was Caleb, a man who hadn't spoken a name with love in years, now whispering it like a prayer, letting it crack open a part of him that had been locked shut since the day the river took everything. And for the first time in a very long time, the silence inside him didn't feel hollow. It felt like the beginning of something. No one said a word. But in that old pickup truck, rolling slowly through the twilight woods, something had already begun. One man, one dog, one fawn. 3 lives, stitched together by something unspoken, were stepping into a new kind of story. Caleb pulled up in front of the small wooden house, where the scent of old timber and fireplace ash lived in the cracks between the bricks. He got out quietly, opened the back door, and lifted Dottie into his arms, holding her like a pillow that hadn't dried yet. Her fur was still damp. Ears drooped, legs tucked in close, like she was still afraid of touching the air. Inside, Caleb lit the fire. The wind slipped through the window cracks, stirring the smoke gently upward into pale ribbons against the ceiling. The room slowly warmed, but he still pulled the heavy blanket from the closet and laid it carefully near the hearth. He set Dottie down as if placing something delicate, something breakable, onto velvet. Then he knelt beside her, one knee to the floor, waiting. One breath, then another. Faint, but steady. Still here. Alden padded in behind them. He didn't bark, didn't wait for permission. He walked straight to Dottie, curled beside her, and pressed his side against her tiny frame. No movement after that, no shift, no sound, just presence. He stayed. Like that was the only job left in the world. Caleb eased down into the wooden chair by the fire. He leaned back, arms resting at his sides, eyes fixed on the 2 figures lying in front of him. The flames danced in the reflection of his eyes, casting back a light that hadn't lived there in years. Now and then, the fire cracked small pops that tossed flickers onto the walls, bending shadows into something that looked like they were breathing. And for a second, watching them there, Caleb wondered, who had really been saved today? Was it Dottie, the trembling little fawn, pulled from a river that nearly took her? Or was it him, the man who once swore he'd never bring another living thing into this house, not since he lost his wife, and then his son? Alden didn't move, didn't close his eyes. He just stayed there, warm and still. Dottie shifted slightly, curling tighter like a handful of dry grass pulled from wet earth. Her body flinched when the warmth reached her skin, like it had startled her back into being. Caleb's fingers trembled just a little. But it wasn't from fear. It was something else. Something warmer. Something unfamiliar. Like the first tiny crack in a wall of ice, not enough to collapse it, but just enough to let in a little light. Today he had said a name. Today he had let it live again. a name he once buried deep in a corner of memory too painful to touch. And now, in this quiet room that had forgotten the sound of life, he was watching a dog and a fawn sleep side by side, under the same roof that once held only silence. Maybe the one who'd been rescued wasn't Dottie. Maybe it wasn't even just Alden. Maybe for the first time in years it was him. Caleb Weiler. A man who once believed he had nothing left worth holding on to, now sitting by a fire, heart cracked open just wide enough to feel the heat again. Inside the cabin that clung quietly to the hillside, the fireplace crackled softly in the corner. The flames licked at the stone wall, casting pale, flickering waves across the silver-gray bricks, like ripples on a still lake under moonlight. Caleb had laid Dottie down on a thick, folded blanket beside the fire. His old flannel coat, the one he always said he'd throw out but never did, was doubled up beneath her spine, soft against the sharpness of her bones. A thinner cloth rested gently over her chest, which still rose and fell with faint, uneven shivers from the cold. In the kitchen, the gas burner hummed quietly. A small pot of water trembled with soft bubbles, steam curling toward the wooden ceiling. Caleb leaned in, poured a bit of diluted milk into a battered tin cup, then carefully tipped some into its lid. He brought it over and placed it near Dottie's nose, not too close, not too far. Just enough for the scent to reach her tiny, twitching nostrils. She didn't move right away, didn't drink. Her ears stayed low, her neck curled in. She flinched slightly, pulling deeper into the folds of the blanket like something inside her still hadn't decided this place was safe. Her small legs curled tight. Her shoulders stiffened like survival had taught her that comfort was a trap. Caleb didn't say anything. He just sat down on the wooden stool near the stove, his back slightly hunched, hands clasped loosely in front of him. In the dim, shifting light, his face looked still, almost stern. But beneath it was something quiet unraveling. Not loud, not obvious, but real. He didn't reach out, didn't force it. He just sat and waited. A few feet away, Alden hadn't moved either. Since they stepped into the cabin, his eyes had never left the fawn. His gaze stayed fixed on the blanket, on that fragile creature who'd only just escaped the river's grip. Dottie glanced at him, just a flick of her eyes. But she saw him. Still, calm, steady. Then Alden stood, one step, then another, each movement deliberate and slow, no creeping, no sudden motions, just the quiet steps of an older brother not to frighten, but to say, "You're not alone." He passed Caleb without even looking, made his way to Dottie, and sat down in front of her, tall, composed. His tail swept the wooden floor in one slow arc, his paws aligned, his back straight, ears forward. And only then did Dottie lift her head again. She hesitated, then leaned forward. Her tongue brushed the edge of the lid. One drop of milk disappeared. Then another. There was no rush, no hunger like panic. Each sip was slow, deliberate, as if she was filling something deeper than her belly. Caleb didn't move, but his eyes, they softened. His breath eased out in a long, slow stream, like the air was warming from the inside. This wasn't the sound of old coffee dripping into a silent room. It wasn't the ticking of the clock on the wall. This was something else. The sound of a fawn drinking milk. Gentle, subtle, and completely new. He smiled. Barely, so small that even he didn't notice it at first. It drifted across his face like mist from the warm bowl, vanishing just as fast. But it had been there, real. And for the first time in what felt like forever, the kitchen smelled like warm milk. Not old coffee, not firewood, not dust. It smelled like life. Small. Simple. but enough to push back the cold that had settled too long in a man used to emptiness. Dottie still didn't come close to him. Even with the fire, even with the food, even with the blankets, she stayed tucked in corners, walking slow circles along the walls. She avoided Caleb's eyes like they were traps, like if she held his gaze too long, something in her would get caught, held, owned. Caleb didn't blame her. He wasn't surprised. For a creature pulled from cold water and dropped into a strange world, fear was natural. Distance was survival. And trust, that would come later. Maybe. He kept his distance. Just a few feet away, Caleb sat quietly and let the moment hold itself together. The old blanket lay folded by the hearth, undisturbed. The fire, now just embers and the occasional flicker, cast soft orange patterns across the wooden ceiling. On the wall, the silhouette of Dottie's small ears twitched at each unfamiliar sound, delicate and alert. Alden stayed where he was in the opposite corner, head resting on his front legs, eyes open, still watching. He hadn't looked away from Dottie once since they got home. Night fell quicker than usual. Caleb switched off the kitchen light, leaving just a single amber bulb glowing from the living room. He cracked the window open just a sliver, letting in a breath of cold mountain air. He'd done that for years, ever since his wife passed. Something about that crisp inhale made him feel present, still real, alive. He stood, stretching slow, and made his way over to check on Dottie one last time before heading to bed. But the blanket was empty. Caleb froze. Just a beat. Just long enough for something to stir in his chest. Then a few quiet steps later, he saw her. Dottie wasn't hiding in the corner anymore. She was lying next to Alden, not skittish, not tense. Her little head rested gently on Alden's front paw, her eyes half closed, drifting. Alden hadn't moved. Not a muscle. Only the rhythm of his breath gave him away. And a soft glance toward her, not startled, not annoyed, just aware. Caleb stood still. He didn't say a word. Didn't dare. There, in the softest light of the cabin, a dog and a fawn lay side by side. In a house that had once been nothing but shadows and wind, something had shifted. No one had told Dottie that Alden was safe. No one had told Alden to let her in. But somehow, without words, without rules, something between them had clicked into place, a quiet understanding, as old as the earth. And Caleb, the man who owned the house, the walls, the silence, could only watch from a few steps back. A guest in his own home. He let out a breath, long and low. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was because, for the first time in years, he was witnessing something close to trust, that foreign, distant thing he hadn't let himself believe in anymore. Dawn crept in without fanfare. A thin silver light slid through the window, touching the edge of the wooden wall and draping the room in that kind of early morning calm only mountain folk know, the kind that hums through your ribs before the world wakes up. The fireplace still glowed faintly, the coals low but alive. Their dim warmth threw long shadows across the floor, slow-moving and soft like the breath of someone dreaming. Caleb was still there. Still in that crooked wooden chair, with the warped armrest, the same one he'd sat in for years, drinking cold coffee and staring into nothing. But now his eyes were closed. His breathing was slow, steady. Sleep had come without warning, like slipping on smooth gravel after a long uphill walk. Gentle, silent, undeniable. And when he opened them again, the first thing he saw wasn't the wall, wasn't the table, wasn't the empty cup. It was Dottie. Curled up beside Alden, sound asleep. Her tiny body pressed into his side, rising and falling with every breath. Her head rested right at the bend of his leg, tucked into the warm crook of his paw, a position no creature would ever take unless they felt completely safe. Caleb didn't move. He didn't need to. He just watched and let himself feel it. Those weathered eyes, the ones that had seen too many goodbyes, now settled on a moment that didn't ask for anything, but still gave everything. A wild little fawn, an old soul in a shepherd's body, and a man who had sealed himself off for far too long. No one said a word, yet the room felt full, like it was breathing again, like silence had its own kind of music, soft, slow, and laced with something that felt an awful lot like healing. Caleb rose slowly. The floor creaked under his weight, but it didn't wake them. Not even a twitch. He stepped forward, cautious, like the peace in front of him might shatter if he got too close too fast. He lowered himself to his knees, right there beside them. His hand lifted, paused mid-air. Not from fear, but reverence, like his fingers had forgotten how to touch something gentle. Then, finally, he laid his hand on Dottie's head. Just barely. A whisper of contact. The kind of touch that asks permission even as it's happening. She didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't open her eyes. She just kept sleeping, like that touch had always belonged there. Caleb turned his face to the side, away from the firelight. His jaw clenched gently. He bit down on his bottom lip just enough to hold something in. Not tears exactly, but a kind of ache that felt like thawing. Like something frozen inside him had cracked open just enough to let light in. Not grief, not joy. Just the quiet release that happens when you stop holding yourself together. He stood, took a few steps back, and stopped at the edge of the living room. Dawn was stretching its fingers across the floorboards now, warm and pale. It reached the tips of Alden's paws, brushed along Dottie's back. Caleb looked at them. A dog and a deer. Two lives that should have never met yet, here they were, asleep beside each other like they'd belonged to this house all along. Then, softly, he whispered not to them. Maybe not even to the room, maybe just to whatever part of himself still needed to hear it. If my boy were alive, he'd be about that age now. The words fell into the hush, catching on the crackle of the fire. Caleb leaned back into the old chair, closed his eyes for a breath. But something pulled at him, a quiet shift in the air. He opened his eyes again. Something wasn't right. He didn't hear Alden's steady breathing anymore, or the soft scratch of paws shifting on the floor. A strange stillness filled the space, like someone had quietly stepped out and taken the warmth with them. Caleb stood, turned on the lamp. Its soft glow spilled gently across the room. The blanket by the fireplace was empty. No Dottie, no Alden. His feet found the center of the room. Every step landed a little heavier than the last. The soles of his slippers brushed against old wood, whispering just enough to stir the silence. His heart beat faster. Wind moaned against the eaves. A faint shaft of dawnlight angled through the kitchen window, casting a faint line across the hallway. And that's where he stopped. At the threshold. Because right there, something waited. Through the misted kitchen window, Caleb saw her. Dottie was curled up tightly beneath the sill, pressed close to the cold wall. Her wide eyes stayed fixed on the night outside, as if she were afraid to miss even the smallest whisper from the forest beyond. Every time the wind howled through the cracks in the cabin, her tiny ears twitched. With each gust, her fragile body tensed. But she never moved from that spot. The porch light spilled through the frosted glass, catching her eyes in a soft shimmer. and from where Caleb stood, those eyes looked like they were holding something unspoken, something delicate and deep. And then he saw Alden. The old German shepherd was outside. Not at the fireplace, not in his usual spot by the door, but on the porch in the freezing cold, sitting directly across from Dottie just beyond the glass. His back was to the wind. His eyes were locked on hers. He didn't move, didn't bark, didn't paw at the door. He just sat there, like a silent wall, a shield between the wild wind and the little soul trembling inside. Dottie didn't look away. She didn't hide. She didn't curl deeper into the shadows. She simply stayed right there, watching him. And somehow, that was enough. It was like just knowing Alden was there made the darkness outside a little less terrifying. Minutes passed. Maybe more. Then Alden shifted slowly, like time itself had asked permission. He lay down right by the door, his head resting near the base of the glass. His eyes didn't close. He kept watch. The wind howled across the porch, dragging dry leaves across the floorboards. But Alden didn't flinch. He didn't leave. He stayed whole and quiet. And Caleb, he didn't call him back. He didn't open the door. He just stood in the dark, one hand buried deep in his pocket, the other resting on the counter, eyes blurry behind the misted pain. Because what he was witnessing wasn't instinct. It was presence. A quiet vow that didn't need to be spoken. I'm here. You don't have to face the night alone. And in that stillness, that silent bridge between a house and a porch, between a fawn and a dog, something inside Caleb settled. He didn't step closer. He didn't speak. He just watched. Because this was trust, not his, but theirs, formed not through commands or familiarity, but through simply being there, through choosing to stay. Outside, Dottie's back glowed faintly in the porch light. Her small form curled tighter against the glass, her breath fogging the lower corner of the window with each shallow exhale. Her ears flicked with the wind, but her eyes remained on Alden, a silent connection that didn't need words. The forest behind the house felt like it was holding its breath. No owls, no insects, not even a rustle from the trees. Just the sound of dead leaves brushing across the porch and the fragile rise and fall of Dottie's chest. Then, from the hallway came movement. Not sudden, not loud, just quiet footsteps, soft enough to feel like part of the room. And then Alden was inside. No bark, no scratching. He appeared like the dark itself had shaped into a shepherd and decided to come home. Quiet, steady, like he'd been there all along. Alden didn't look at Caleb, didn't veer off like he sometimes did, as if giving the old man space. Number. This time, Alden walked straight toward her. No hesitation, no sound. He stopped right beside Dottie. For a moment, he simply stood there, head slightly tilted, watching her. Then, without a single cue or glance elsewhere, Alden slowly lowered his body to the floor. His back pressed against the wall, placing himself between Dottie and the draft that slipped under the cabin door. He became a wall, a warm, living one. Dottie didn't flinch, didn't pull away. Instead, her tiny frame began to relax, like something inside her recognized the gesture not with words, but with the part of her spirit that remembered safety. Slowly, she shifted. Just a little. Just enough to lean into that new shelter. No panic, no pause. Just trust. Alden stayed perfectly still, eyes open, facing the woods, his gaze locked on the darkness outside like he was telling the night itself, not here, not tonight, not while I'm breathing. Dottie let her head fall gently against Alden's front paw. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. No one had to teach them this, no command was spoken. But in that sliver of silence, Two souls, one trembling from a second chance at life, the other weathered by years of loyalty and loss, found each other. On the coldest night of winter, in the warmest corner of the room, Caleb stood in the shadowed hallway, one hand resting over his chest. His heart had just skipped, not from shock, not from grief, but from something else entirely. Something that made him feel small, in the presence of something sacred. He didn't know what to call it, didn't dare name it. But he knew this much: it didn't come from man. Caleb slowly turned away, heading for the living room. But just before he disappeared into the dark, he looked back. The porch light still glowed faintly through the glass, casting a soft beam across Alden's fur. It looked like a golden wall, gentle and solid, wrapped around them both. And within that wall, Dottie had closed her eyes, breathing steady, safe, asleep, for the first time since the river. Caleb stood still at the threshold. He didn't speak, didn't move, just breathed long and deep, like someone afraid to wake a moment that wasn't meant to last. He couldn't remember the last time he'd seen something this tender. Maybe it had been years, maybe never. Then, slowly, he stepped back, not to leave, but to hold the whole scene in view, to take in every line, every shadow, every whisper of warmth. His hand reached for the drawer near the table. Inside was a relic, an old phone-cracked screen, almost always dead. Forgotten for so long it had become part of the wood. He powered it on. The screen flickered, buzzed, struggled, then lit up. The camera still worked. Caleb raised it gently, carefully, like he was touching a scar that had never quite healed. He didn't adjust the settings, didn't aim for the perfect shot. He just let it be, as it was, exactly as it was meant to be. In the frame, Dottie lay curled beside Alden. Their shadows stretched long across the worn wooden floor. Behind them, the window was fogged with breath and cold, but just enough porch light spilled through to trace the soft outlines of life. Small, fragile, but unmistakably alive. A soft click broke the silence. Quiet. Barely there. No one flinched, no one stirred. Caleb lowered the phone. The screen glowed dimly, showing the photo a little blurred, colors cooled by the room's hush. But the feeling in it was undeniable. Raw. True. The kind that doesn't need sharp focus to be clear. His hand closed gently around the phone. It had been so long since he held a picture that wasn't from the past. So long since it captured something still breathing, something still becoming. Maybe something that might stay. He saved the photo. Didn't name it. Didn't tag the moment. Just let it sit there. Quiet and full. But a few seconds later, his finger drifted to the little notes bar beneath the image. And for reasons he couldn't explain, not even to himself, he typed a few words. Slowly. Carefully. Like writing a letter not to the world, but to the quietest part of himself. Nightwind, a fawn, a guardian, and something coming back. He didn't know what that something was. Maybe it was trust, maybe it was the feeling of being needed again, or maybe it was just a reason, a small, stubborn reason, to not feel so empty when the sky turned dark. He turned off the screen, slipped the phone back into the drawer. Then he turned toward the fire, sat down again in the old wooden chair beside the hearth. Didn't say a word. Didn't need to. His eyes found Dottie, still fast asleep, and Alden still watching, still guarding, his eyes half closed but never unaware. The fire crackled softly in the background. The wind kept pressing against the windows. But tonight, in that little wooden house at the edge of the forest, something had shifted. Something had changed. And it didn't need a name. Morning came soft and slow. The first rays of sunlight spilled over the treetops, brushing the backyard with a light gold mist. Caleb opened the back door, coffee steaming in his hand, and stepped onto the porch. The air was cold enough to bite, but he barely noticed. What he was waiting for was already out there. Alden moved first. No signal, no rush, just the same steady ritual he'd kept for years. He walked the yard with purpose, nose low, tail even, tracing familiar trails across the grass. Around the stump, near the fence post, then back again. Every movement deliberate, like music written into his bones from all those years of training. No one told him to do it. He just did. That's how Alden greeted every morning, by remembering who he was. Dottie lingered at the top step. Her front hooves tapped the wood once, then stilled. She tilted her head, ears flicking at the wind, as if the air itself was unfamiliar. She took one step forward, then paused. The porch was safety. The grass was too open, too big. She didn't move again. Caleb didn't speak, didn't urge her on. He just sat on the porch chair, mug warming his hands, eyes watching the way the world breathed in front of him. Alden was looping back, calm as ever, and Dottie, still frozen on the edge, caught something in the way he moved. Maybe it was how his feet brushed the grass, or how his body curved with the wind. Whatever it was, it drew her. She stepped down. One hoof, then the next. Stopped, then took another. Not fast, not fearless, but forward. Alden didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He simply slowed down, just enough. Dottie followed. Not close, not far, but in the same direction. That was enough. Caleb took a sip of coffee. It wasn't hot anymore, but the bitterness had softened. He watched them, one large, one small, the morning light stretching their shadows side by side across the damp grass. There were no commands, no pressure, no signs exchanged. But they moved as if they'd always been meant to. Every day since she'd arrived, Dottie had been watching. She never walked far, only a few steps from the porch, then back again. But her eyes, they always followed Alden, like he was the only map that made sense. And Alden never once looked back, but he always slowed, as if he could feel the tiny breath behind him, trying to catch up. This wasn't a chase, it wasn't training, it was something softer, something that didn't need names. Caleb sat still, not wanting to disturb what was unfolding. The sun lit the tops of the trees, and the grass glistened with the last of the morning dew. Dottie moved like she was remembering something her body hadn't learned yet. Alden moved like he was making space for her to try. Then one morning, it happened. They ran. Side by side. Not in sync, not perfectly, but together. Dottie's legs kicked a little higher, clumsy but determined. Alden kept his stride even, steady. Between them stretched a space, a shared rhythm wide enough to breathe, close enough to matter. They weren't chasing anything. They weren't being chased. They were just alive. And they were learning how to be alive together. Caleb stood on the porch, coffee forgotten in his hand, a breath caught somewhere deep in his chest. He didn't smile. Not really. But something inside him softened and stayed warm, even as the wind began to stir the trees again. And Caleb thought, maybe this is how the broken find each other again, not through words, but through footsteps, heading the same way. He drew in a deep breath. The morning air carried the scent of damp earth and fresh grass, soaked in the quiet stillness of a world just waking up. And something inside Caleb, something he thought had gone silent, began to stir again. Because sometimes you don't need someone to keep your pace. You just need someone willing to slow down and wait. Caleb stood at the edge of the wooden porch, fingers gently brushing the doorframe. The breeze slipped through his flannel shirt, cool against his skin, laced with the smell of wet leaves and softened soil. The coffee in his hand had long since gone cold, but he hadn't touched it. Out there were Alden and Dottie. Alden was doing what he always did. Same path, same rhythm, circling the yard with that quiet discipline that never fully left him. But this time, something had changed. Dottie wasn't just watching. She was moving, not quickly, not smoothly, but moving. Caleb's brow furrowed slightly. He wasn't sure if he should follow. It had been so long since he'd stepped barefoot into a dew-soaked morning. So long since he'd walked this yard with any sense of purpose. But something nudged him. He crouched slowly, set the cold coffee down on the wooden step, took a breath, and stepped into the grass. The chill kissed his heels first, sharp, clean, bracing. But it was real, and that was something. Caleb straightened his back and walked, not fast, not slow, just enough. Enough to feel it, enough to close the distance. Ahead, Alden didn't look back, but his gait stretched wider, giving space. Dottie paused, turned her head, then kept going. Caleb said nothing, didn't smile. He simply walked, steady and quiet, matching their pace as best he could without disturbing the fragile shape of the moment. A man, a German shepherd, a baby deer still learning how to stand her ground. 3 rhythms not the same, but somehow in tune. They didn't march. They didn't run. They just moved. A quiet loop around the yard Caleb had once believed would never hold life again. And somewhere between the first turn and the second, Caleb let out a long, slow breath. Not from exhaustion, but from something deeper. Something was loosening in his chest. A memory. A scar, a frozen thread of feeling he thought had gone numb for good. But here it was. Melting. Gently. Completely. In the soft hush of a new morning. When they made it back to the porch, Alden had stopped. Dottie stood beside him. They didn't advance. They didn't retreat. They just waited. No signal, no gesture. But the waiting said it all. And Caleb understood he hadn't walked that path alone. Not today, not anymore. He bent down, rested his hand on Alden's head, then gently brushed his palm along Dottie's slender back. Just a touch. Just one breath. A moment so ordinary, and yet it held enough warmth to make him feel less alone. In that quiet yard, with the sun rising higher, golden light spilled across the grass. The chill faded, and inside Caleb's chest, a single word surfaced. Soft, unspoken, but certain. Family. He stood on the porch, coffee still faintly warm in his hand, watching the 2 figures walking ahead, one large, one small, moving along the narrow path that curved past the backyard fence. It was the same path that led to Elma's place. Old Elma, his neighbor, from 3 doors down. The one who always wore wool cardigans and smelled like dried lavender and lemon balm. Caleb still walked over every Friday to help her tend that scrappy garden out back, the one filled with daisies, dry moss, and weeds she refused to pull. Alden walked ahead with steady steps, not rushing, as if he remembered every knot in every route along the way. Dottie ran forward, then stopped, looked back, waited. Sometimes she'd fall into step beside Alden. Other times she'd bound ahead, but never far, never out of sight. The trail cut through a pair of aging pines. Dry leaves crunched beneath their feet, whispering like old ghosts. Sunlight spilled through the trees in soft flickers, casting golden freckles across the dirt. Caleb wore his old flannel, the same faded red and black he always grabbed, when the morning-turned brisk shovel slung in one hand, the other tucked into his coat pocket. A worn wooden toothpick rested between his teeth, like it always had on these quiet walks. Like every Friday, there were no words. He just followed. Let Alden and Dottie lead because something in him trusted their direction more than his own. Soon they reached the old gate in front of Elma's yard. Everything looked just as it always did. The creaky rattan chair still sat by the porch. Her long wool shawl hung on its usual hook by the door, swaying gently in the breeze. Caleb paused to unlatch the wooden gate. It squealed open like an old friend waking from sleep. Alden and Dottie stepped in first, their feet making soft sounds on the packed dirt path. They didn't need instructions, just like always. They took a few rounds through the yard, sniffing, mapping, remembering. Dottie veered toward the back garden near the crumbling pig pen, where Elma kept a patch of wildflowers fenced in by crooked stones. Caleb turned to loop the shovel onto the branch he always used. Then, woof! A sharp bark cracked the silence, then two more, quick, urgent, not play, not confusion. Caleb spun around. Alden was less than 10 feet from the old pig pen, body rigid, ears flattened, eyes locked ahead. A low growl pulsed from deep in his chest. Dottie stood frozen beside him, her legs braced, nose pointed to the ground, ears standing like little arrows. The air turned heavy. Still. Electric. Caleb dropped the shovel without thinking. The clang hit the ground behind him, but he was already running, boots thudding hard over grass and soil. His gut twisted. That cold whisper down his spine wasn't just a shiver. Something wasn't right, and every step he took made that certainty grow louder. Early morning. The backyard of the little cabin was wrapped in that kind of calm only found at dawn, where the wind moved slow, the trees breathed quiet, and every blade of grass glistened with dew. Normally, that calm would be interrupted by the soft rhythm of paws brushing over earth, by the joyful dance of footsteps, a dog and a deer playing tag through the fog. But not today. Caleb stood at the porch, coffee still steaming in his hand. Something felt off. He couldn't quite name it, but he felt it in his bones. There was no gentle bark as Alden chased shadows beneath the oak. No scamper of hooves trying to keep up. No Dottie. Dottie wasn't chasing anything this morning. She stood at the far edge of the yard, right at the invisible line where Caleb's world ended and the wild began. Past the last row of trees, past the fence no one ever fixed. Still. Head tilted. Ears pointed toward the forest like antennae. Not afraid, not restless, just listening. As if something out there was calling her something only she could hear. A heartbeat maybe, a whisper, or just that old primal pull. Caleb placed his mug down, rested his hand on the porch railing. He didn't blink. She stayed like that for a long time. And the next morning, it happened again. Dottie stepped outside, bypassed the familiar path she once shared with Alden, and walked straight to the trees. Stopped, watched, waited, smelled. Sometimes she'd shift a few inches closer. But she never crossed. It wasn't a fluke. It wasn't curiosity. It was something deeper, like instinct was waking up. And Alden he didn't run like before either. He no longer tried to play, no longer nudged Dottie's side with his nose, urging her to come join the chase. He stayed back, close but not in the way. And when Dottie stood at the edge of the forest, Alden stopped too, watching, guarding. As if he knew something sacred was happening, something that didn't need interference, only respect, only silence. Caleb watched them both, and in his chest something tightened gently, like the hush before a storm that never comes. It wasn't fear, it wasn't sadness either. It was the feeling you get when you know something's about to change, not in a loud, breaking way, but like snow melting quietly under the first breath of spring. He whispered it to himself, not out loud, just under his breath, like you do when you're scared to admit a truth. She's going to leave. But this time, it wasn't like before. Not like when his daughter left and never came back. Not like the day he buried a wedding ring beneath the pine and stood there long after the last shovelful of earth. This wasn't a loss. This felt like a return. Dottie was no longer the fragile thing they'd pulled from the stream, no longer that trembling shadow hiding behind the stove. Now her eyes were clear. Her legs carried her with confidence. She didn't just survive, she grew. She remembered how to belong to the world she came from. And Caleb, for all the grief, all the goodbyes, felt something else rise up this time. Not sorrow, but gratitude. Because he'd been given a gift not everyone gets. He got to witness it, all of it. From the first shiver to the quiet strength, moment by moment. And he knew the goodbye was coming. Not today, not yet, but soon. Each movement, each tiny change, quiet but deep like the shift of a season. You don't see it coming, but you feel it in your bones. And Alden, the silent, loyal sentinel, was always there, never in the way, never holding Dottie back, just present, watching, guarding, waiting, the same way Caleb once stood by Alden years ago. And now both of them were learning something no one ever teaches you, when to hold on and when to let go. That morning, Caleb knew. It was time to start preparing. But he didn't rush, because Dottie was still there, still within the yard, still choosing to stay. And sometimes just one more day is the greatest gift of all. That afternoon, the sun came soft, gentle enough to soak into the old wood of the porch and spill across the patchy grass. Caleb opened the back door, a small porcelain dish in hand, with a few thin slices of apple neatly placed. He walked slowly, boots leaving prints in the softened dirt, and sat down on the familiar step saying nothing, letting the breeze and sunlight do the talking. In the middle of the yard, Dottie lay curled up, her back pressed against Alden's belly. A little hill of breath rising and falling. Still. Warm. Safe. Alden didn't move. He just rested his chin on his front paws, eyes half closed like he was standing guard over a dream that didn't belong to him. Caleb set the apple dish down. Not too close, not too far. He didn't call out, didn't coax. He just waited. Dottie watched, but stayed still. Not until Alden lifted his head, padded forward, and took a bite did Dottie slowly rise. Her legs moved with a gentleness that almost seemed sacred, like any sudden gesture might break the fragile peace wrapped around them all. Then she stepped toward the plate and ate a slice. Then another. Slow, deliberate, but always with one eye glancing toward Caleb. He smiled. Not a wide grin, not a proud one, just a soft pull at the corner of his mouth because he saw it. Dottie wasn't afraid of him anymore. She wasn't flinching, she wasn't hiding. But she still only felt completely safe when Alden was near. A bridge, a translator, a steady back to lean on. Caleb brushed his worn shirt sleeve against his palm, then eased himself all the way down into the dirt. Cold seeped through the fabric of his pants, but he didn't mind. The wind slipped past the porch roof and ran across his shoulder, carrying his voice, gravelly, slow but warm, into the air. We made it here, each in our own way, but we all found our way back. No one replied. But the way Alden settled back down beside the apple dish, and the way Dottie shifted just a few inches closer to Caleb, filled the space between them with something more than silence. Something alive. It was like another presence had quietly stepped into the yard, not a person, not a sound, just a feeling. A feeling that said, "We belong." Caleb let out a long breath, set his hand gently on his knee, and watched the two creatures before him. One dog, one deer somehow completing a picture he thought he had lost forever. And then, unexpectedly, his mind wandered to the old dining table inside. No one had sat around that table in years. So many meals eaten alone. So many nights spent listening to the echo of his own fork against the plate. But right now, in this yard, Caleb felt like he was sitting at a table again. Not alone, but with family. That night, when he lay down in bed and rested his head on the same flattened pillow he'd used for a decade, Caleb didn't expect to dream. But sometimes when the heart is full, sleep doesn't just come. It arrives bearing stories the soul still wants to tell. But in the dream, Caleb found himself in a sunlit forest. Leaves shimmered in the wind, and a silk-thin mist slid low across the ground like a ribbon pulled by invisible hands. Then, from the far edge of that stillness, came a call, Dottie's voice. But not as the tiny, trembling creature he first rescued. She wasn't curled up beside anyone. She wasn't waiting to be held. Dottie stood tall, alone, in the center of the clearing, on her own legs, calling back, not in fear, but in invitation, as if she was waiting for someone to follow her home. When Caleb woke, the light had shifted. Sun poured through the window, painting his bedroom in soft gold. The dream still hung in the corners of his mind, strangely clear, like it had happened not while he slept, but while he simply closed his eyes to remember. He didn't try to hold on to it. He just breathed out slowly and stood. When he opened the back door, there she was. Dottie, standing exactly where the forest began. Still, not looking back. Her neck stretched forward, ears alert, eyes fixed on the woods, those thick, knotted trees that swallowed the morning sun like they understood its language better than any living thing. The wind tugged through the clearing, and the fur along Dottie's spine quivered like young grass just learning to stand. Behind her, a few steps away, sat Alden, silent, still. Alden didn't call out, didn't approach. He just waited, like a companion who knew there were some journeys you didn't interrupt. Only witness, only honor. Caleb said nothing. He stayed on the porch, the wooden steps cold beneath his bare feet. And in that fragile hush, time seemed to pause. Caleb looked down at his own hands, weathered, thinned by age and years of holding on too tightly to things that were never meant to stay. And that's when it came to him, a sentence soft as breath. You can't hold on to what belongs to the wild. Dottie didn't turn around. She didn't need to, because something in the way she stood, quiet, focused, wholly still, told Caleb everything he needed to know. It was time. No push, no pull, just a knowing. Caleb gave a small nod. To no one in particular, but inside, he knew what that nod meant. He had made a decision. Not as a rescuer, not as a man clinging to what gave him comfort, but as a father learning how and when to let go. He would take Dottie home, not to abandon her, but to return her, to let her walk back into the place her bones remembered, where roots ran deep, where wind carried the scent of ancestors, and where her spirit had been quietly pulling her all along. But she wouldn't go alone, and neither would he, because some journeys aren't meant for one set of footsteps. They require 3, Caleb, Dottie, and Alden. A man who once forgot how to live in the light. A dog who had given his whole life to service and quiet loyalty. And a deer born of the wild, but raised by love. 3 hearts, 3 paths, bound for a forest waiting to receive them all. He looked at them both. Alden had already stepped forward, just one quiet step closer to Dottie, a silent confirmation that no one needed to say aloud. And Dottie, still facing the forest, had finally stopped holding her breath. As if all she'd been waiting for was that one presence behind her. That one familiar shadow. Caleb stepped down from the porch. The morning breeze felt lighter than usual, gentler somehow, like it too knew what was coming. And in that moment, with sunlight pouring over the pale wood and stretching long across the yard, Caleb felt it clearly. A new chapter was beginning. He sat in the worn chair by the railing. In his hand was a weathered, leather-bound notebook. For years it had held only sketches, a few scattered names, and memories that no longer spoke to anyone but him. Then Caleb stood and walked back inside. He opened the drawer beneath the old kitchen table, one that hadn't been moved in years, and pulled out a crumpled map. The folds were deep, frayed at the creases, and its colors had faded to dusty shades. But the red ink was still there. A map of the Northern National Forest, marked in red from another lifetime, a lifetime of tracking deer through snowbanks, of mapping their paths from watering holes to hidden valleys. Back when a friend of his in Forest Service used to send him tips, Caleb would mark every whispered route on paper like sacred trails meant for return. This time he didn't look for signs to follow. He circled places to return to. Caleb smoothed the paper down on the table. He reached for a red pencil, then paused just for a second before he began to draw the first loop. Not for pursuit, for release. Below the table, Dottie had quietly curled up by his boots. Her small head rested gently on her front hooves, her ears alert, eyes locked on the map above. Occasionally, her ears twitched as if something old and familiar was waking inside her. Some memory of open land, of streams and cedar. Caleb paused his hand, looked down. Dottie didn't move. But in her gaze, he saw it, that she knew. That map, with its softened folds and faded ink, wasn't for Caleb. It was for her. By the window, Alden lay on his side, his body long and relaxed, eyes half closed. But his ears kept moving, just slightly, every time the chair creaked, or Caleb murmured something under his breath. Alden didn't need to see. He was already tuned in. A sentinel at rest, but never off duty. Caleb drew a small circle near Pine Creek, a quiet spot where he once saw a herd slip through the fog like ghosts. Then another, farther off, near the Cedar Ridge drop-off. He had never walked that path, only heard stories of does bringing their young there when spring softened the cliffs. Each circle meant something. A question, a memory, a promise. "We don't know exactly where we're going," Caleb said softly, the words low and steady, spoken into the quiet kitchen as much as into his own chest. "But we'll get there. Together." No one wrote that vow down. No witness signed it. But in Dottie's wide, watchful eyes, and in the soft flick of Alden's ear at the sound of Caleb's voice, he knew it had been heard. 3 heartbeats. 3 rhythms in sync. No destination yet, no timeline, but a direction. A journey is about to begin. Caleb folded the map gently, like it was something sacred, not paper. He ran his hand down a softened crease, then turned to look at the 2 lives that had remade his house into a home. A dog, a deer, a man, and a silent promise not needing a single signature, because it would be kept. completely, and with all the heart he had left. That morning, just as Caleb was tightening the last strap on the old canvas bag in the truck bed, a familiar voice floated softly from behind the wooden fence. "Mr. Caleb." It was Elma, wrapped in a dark knit sweater, a scarf looped around her neck, and carrying a weathered wicker basket. Her steps were slow and careful, but her smile was warm enough to light the whole yard. "Don't tell me you're planning to work the garden again," Caleb teased as he stood. "Number not today." She lifted the basket slightly. "Just thought I'd bring something over." She approached and held it out. A few leftover plums, some apples, and this. From inside the basket, Elma pulled out a small note, folded neatly in quarters. The paper was old, its edges soft from time, but the handwriting was clear, a little shaky, but unmistakably hers. Caleb took it gently and unfolded it. "Caleb, I've never been good with words, so please don't laugh. This morning, while I was sipping tea on the porch, I realized something. I'm still alive. And maybe that sounds simple, but it isn't. If it hadn't been for you, for Alden, and that little deer, I might not be here writing this. 3 beings, a man, a dog, and a deer, didn't say a word. But somehow, quietly, you saved me. I've packed some apples and dried plums. Take them along. If you pass by again, I'll pick more. I hope this journey you're about to take goes and gently. The way it all began. Elma." Caleb read it slowly. When he finished, he folded the letter back with care, tucking it into the inside pocket of his flannel, the same place he used to carry an old photo of his family. His hand paused there for a second, thumb brushing the edge of the paper like it held something sacred. Alden wandered over and sniffed the edge of the basket. Elma laughed and leaned down to pat his head. "You take good care of them now, Alden. You hear?" Dottie stood quietly at the edge of the yard. She didn't move closer, but her ears tilted back ever so slightly. Her gaze lingered on the old woman. No bark, no sound, just recognition. Familiar. Gentle. Caleb pulled the truck door open. Alden hopped in first, settling into his usual spot at the left side of the truck bed like he had a designated seat. Dottie circled once, then climbed up beside him, curling in close, side pressed to side. Caleb climbed into the cab, buckled the worn seat belt, and started the engine. The old truck rumbled to life with a low, steady hum, soft and calm, like a deep breath breaking the dawn. The pickup eased onto the narrow dirt path. Tall grass brushed both sides, and the sun filtered through the trees in fractured golden shafts. A man, a dog, a deer. 3 lives, 3 rhythms, beginning something new. From her porch, Elma stood watching them go. She didn't wave. She just held one hand in the air, high and still, as if sending something invisible with it. And ahead, the forest waited. The road wasn't paved. Rocks jutted out, roots tangled beneath the surface. Deep tracks from old tires cut into the hardened spring dirt, marking the way forward. But no one complained. No one hesitated. Because sometimes the most important journeys aren't about where you're going. They're about who's beside you, when you begin. Under the weight of time, his body may have slowed, but Caleb's eyes stayed clear. Still looking forward. Toward the thinning sunlight, slipping gently between the treetops ahead. In the back seat, Dottie sat close to the window, her nose gently pressed to the glass. Every time the truck paused, even briefly, Dottie leaned in closer, sniffing the air with quiet intent, like she was listening to something that couldn't be heard. Not sound, but scent. Wind. The soft trace of a herd that had once passed this way. Something only she could understand. Alden followed behind her, silent and steady. He never pushed ahead. Never rushed. But he kept close enough to protect, and far enough to let Dottie walk on her own terms. His gaze swept each side of the road like an old habit, alert and watchful, like guarding a mission that was never spoken aloud. After more than an hour, Caleb pulled the truck to a stop near the forest's edge, where the trail narrowed too tightly for wheels to go further. He stepped out slowly and opened the back hatch. Dottie was first to leap down light, cautious and graceful. Then Alden, sturdy and precise, landed without a sound. From here on, they walked. The forest path grew narrow. Branches brushed against Caleb's flannel sleeves. Dewy grass clung to the hem of his pants. He didn't lead, but he wasn't left behind either. They moved together in 3 rhythms, never perfectly in sync, but never drifting apart. At a wide old tree with roots like open hands, Caleb paused. His fingers reached into the breast pocket of his coat, touching the fold of Elma's letter. He pulled it halfway out. Didn't read it, just looked. A long, steady look, then folded it again. Slow, careful, like tucking away something sacred. He didn't need to read it anymore, because by now, Caleb understood what was pulling them forward wasn't logic. It wasn't planning. It was something deeper, something wordless, a responsibility to life itself. Dottie walked ahead now, not hesitating as much. Her steps had purpose, and behind her, Alden scanned the path, pausing now and then to glance at Caleb. Not out of concern. Just checking. Is your pace all right? Are you still with us? 3 beings, 3 pasts, each forged in a different kind of fire. A man who had once given up, a dog trained for sacrifice, and a young deer pulled from death's grip by hands that didn't expect to hold hope again. Now they shared the same path. No one hurried, but no one stopped either. Caleb glanced down at the trail beneath his boots. One set of prints was small and light, one broad and confident, one deep and slow, pressed down by years. He smiled to himself, whispered like confessing to the wind. Some promises don't need to be said out loud. You just walk, and by walking together you keep them. That morning, the sun hadn't yet pierced through the delicate veil of mist blanketing the roots of the old pines. The air was cool and damp, but strangely gentle, like the forest was holding its breath, quietly bracing for something sacred. Dottie stood still, head tilted ever so slightly. Even the faintest rustle among the leaves made her ears flick upright, eyes glinting with a brightness Caleb hadn't seen before. He almost stepped forward, but stopped, because something in the air had shifted. It wasn't the sound, it was the scent, a trace on the wind, maybe left behind by a herd that once passed through, or perhaps one figure Dottie had never truly forgotten. Dottie began to walk, not with hesitation, not waiting for a signal, just a few small steps, quiet, certain. No one called her forward, no one gave a command. It was instinct, raw and undisturbed, pulling her ahead like an invisible thread woven into the trees. Alden stayed behind. He didn't bark, didn't move to follow right away. He just watched, his gaze deep and unwavering. He didn't crowd her. He never had. Always close enough to protect, but far enough to give Dottie space to find her own footing. Caleb gripped the strap of his backpack. He knew now. This wasn't just a journey to return a young animal to the wild. It had become something else, something far more intimate. A return not to a place, but to self, to memory, to something that had been waiting quietly all along. Dottie weaved through the narrow forest paths, her hooves brushing against dry grass, shoulders brushing dew from the leaves. But she didn't stop. Her eyes, no longer the uncertain gaze of a fragile creature, held a clarity that could only come from knowing where one truly belonged. Then, it happened. In a clearing streaked with fractured sunlight, a figure emerged. A doe. Larger than Dottie. Lean. Her coat was darker, aged by time and weather. She stood perfectly still. Dottie froze. She didn't bolt. She didn't run forward. She just looked. Her ears quivered. Her nose twitched with cautious recognition. Her eyes wide, not with fear, but realization. Caleb stopped breathing. His hand instinctively rested on Alden's shoulder, anchoring him in that electric stillness. No words passed. No sounds stirred. But between Dottie and the doe, something ancient was being spoken. Something beyond language, beyond logic. Pure animal memory. Alden stood like a sentinel, his posture relaxed, almost reverent. He didn't scan the woods anymore. His watchful eyes were now soft, still as if guarding the quiet reunion before them, making sure it unfolded just as it was meant to. Caleb's grip on his pack tightened. A long breath escaped him, slow and steady. In his chest, something settled. Something old. Something aching. Dottie was walking the right path, her path, and sometimes the best thing a grown man can do is simply step aside and let the miracle happen. So Caleb stayed where he was. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He raised a hand gently, signaling Alden without a word. Let her go. Dottie moved forward. Not fast but deliberate. Her hooves pressed into the leaf-littered earth, leaving faint prints edged in mist. Her tail is low, her head dipped in instinctive humility, but her steps, they never wavered. The doe remained motionless, waiting, like she had always been waiting. The wind stirred through the canopy, brushing against their ears, one set large and worn, the other smaller, still learning. No calls, no signs. But Dottie walked as if guided by some long-lost melody only she could hear, a song that lived in her bones. And then, finally, they stood face to face, a young deer marked by pain, softened by care, an older doe worn thin by time, yet still standing. And in that moment between them, something clicked into place, like a bone finding its joint, like a soul remembering where it belongs. Caleb's eyes filled, but he didn't blink. Because that was the soundless truth he'd been carrying without knowing. Sometimes love means leading someone home, just far enough to let them walk the rest alone. Caleb swallowed hard. His hand found Alden's shoulder, steadying himself as much as the dog. Everything around them had gone so silent that Caleb could hear his own heartbeat pounding inside the hush. And then, bang! The gunshot ripped through the forest like a blade slicing a crescendo in half. Sharp, sudden, brutal. The doe collapsed. No cry, no struggle. Just the heavy final thud of a body hitting damp earth in the same place that just seconds earlier had felt like a sacred homecoming. Dottie froze. Her whole body trembled, eyes wide, neck stretching forward instinctively, desperately, but her legs refused to move, like the world had just shattered in front of her. There was no blood spray, but something spilled from Dottie's gaze. It wasn't red. It wasn't black. It was clear, like a memory. Caleb dropped to his knees, hands clutching his thighs, fingers trembling, face pale as if he'd been shot himself. His lips moved, trying to form words, but nothing came. Alden didn't wait for an order. He surged forward, no hesitation. In seconds, he was standing between Dottie and the fallen doe, shoulders lowered, muscles braced. A deep growl vibrated low from his throat, and his eyes scanned the tree line like twin blades. Everything about his stance screamed, "No one gets closer!" Caleb watched him, and for the first time since Alden retired, he didn't just see his dog. He saw the soldier, the guardian, not in pursuit of a target, but in protection of something sacred, in defense of another soul. Dottie didn't move. She just stretched her neck like she still believed she could catch one final breath in the air, one thread of warmth. But there was nothing, only the faint, bitter scent of gunpowder drifting through the wind. Caleb didn't know who fired the shot. No one stepped forward, not a single voice, just the forest, and the kind of silence that felt like a scream held back by every tree. And in that moment, Caleb understood. Not every journey ends in fairness. Not every right choice is rewarded. Some losses hit like stray bullets, sudden, senseless, and cruel. But they still rip your heart open all the same. So he stayed there, sitting. Alden stood guard. Dottie is still motionless, three forms frozen by grief, holding on to the last warmth of a reunion that never had time to finish. Then, through the branches beyond, the sound of rustling leaves. Footsteps. A group of men emerged from the shadows, dressed in camouflage, rifles slung casually over their shoulders, voices light with laughter, faces relaxed, as if they'd just wrapped up a game. There was no remorse, no hesitation, no understanding of what they had shattered. One of the men shrugged, glanced at the fallen doe on the forest floor, and spoke like he was answering for everyone. She was alone, didn't see anyone around. Wild deer, it's legal. Caleb forced himself upright, stepping forward. His voice sliced through the air like a blade. "You killed a creature, in the middle of reuniting with her own child!" No one responded. They looked at each other. One sighed, another turned away. But not a single man apologized. Not one bowed his head. A different hunter, older, probably the leader, spoke up quickly. "We followed the local game laws. No one crossed any boundaries. If you've got a complaint, call the sheriff." Caleb trembled not from the cold, but from the kind of helpless rage that burns without a place to go. There was no one to punch, no one to scream at who'd truly understand what had just been stolen. About 20 minutes later, a local patrol car pulled up. A young officer stepped out, notebook in hand. He listened as Caleb recounted everything clearly, steadily, with pain in every word. Then the officer flipped through his notebook, jotted something down, and closed it. "I'm sorry, sir. There's no indication of a crime. They didn't leave the legal hunting zone, and deer aren't listed as protected in this region." Caleb said nothing. His eyes were bloodshot but dry now. There were no tears left to fall. No one was arrested. No one was handcuffed. No one even acknowledged what had happened. It was all wrapped up in the neat, cold language of paperwork, clean and emotionless. When Caleb returned to the clearing, Dottie was still there. Her eyes were wide open, but they no longer saw anything clearly. The wind rustled her tail, but her small, stunned body was frozen in place, like time had stopped right there with her. Alden stood guard in front of her, his posture unshaken. He didn't bark. He didn't move. But his eyes never left the tree line, scanning like he expected another threat at any moment. Caleb walked slowly toward them. Each step felt like dragging stone, but he kept moving until just a few feet away. Then he stopped and reached out, his arms gently wrapped around Dottie's neck from behind. He didn't pull. He didn't hold tight. Just enough to let her feel that someone was there, that she was not alone in this. Dottie didn't turn, didn't make a sound, but her body started to tremble. Not from fear, but from a silent wave crashing through her, a grief too heavy for her small frame to contain. Caleb lowered his head, resting it against her neck. He didn't speak, just kept one hand stroking the soft fur at her nape, the part that shivered like a rising tide with no shore to crash into. Some pain doesn't ask for justice. It just needs to be held without question. Caleb couldn't remember how long he stayed there, sitting against that old tree trunk. The chill of the earth eventually seeped through his worn pants. But he didn't move. Because sometimes, staying still is the only thing you can do. To say, I'm here. I saw. And I will not let this be forgotten. The ground was cold beneath him, the kind of cold that seeped through old fabric and settled deep into the joints. Both of Caleb's knees ached sharply, but he didn't want to get up. Because Dottie hadn't left, and Alden was still standing guard, like a living monument carved in honor of grief. The forest darkened quickly. The light receded like a retreating soldier, humbled and worn. Mist slipped through every branch, curling down to the forest floor with a hush too heavy to name. Caleb leaned forward slightly and moved closer. His hand rested gently on Dottie's back, where her body still trembled with broken breaths. No one said a word, but in that stillness, a decision was made. Quietly, deeply, like a stream beneath the soil changing course, no noise, but unstoppable. The next morning, before the first rays of sun had burned through the veil of fog, Caleb stood up and shouldered his backpack. He didn't call, didn't explain. He just walked, following the same narrow trail they'd taken 3 days earlier. And behind him, Dottie moved, one step, then another. No fear, no hesitation, just choice. Quiet and clear. Alden took the center position. Every strong step from Alden was like a living bridge between two fragile hearts, one that had once lost its sense of direction and one that had lost its faith. But now they moved forward on the same path, breathing in rhythm, needing no commands. The forest didn't speak. Only dry leaves crunched beneath their feet, and the soft wind moved through pine branches, whispering a farewell that didn't need words. And yet, that sound confirmed something. This journey wasn't over. It had simply turned another page. Midway up a sloping hill, Caleb paused. He turned. Dottie was moving just behind, light on her feet, and Alden had just stepped through a beam of scattered sunlight spilling through the trees. For one short second, Caleb saw something like every scar in their hearts was finding its way home. He stood there with his hands braced on his knees, exhaling slowly. Not from exhaustion, but because something deep inside was guiding him again, something beyond reason, something he hadn't trusted in years, his own instinct to believe, that a new beginning was still possible. No one belongs anywhere forever, he thought. But some places, you get to choose again. Dottie stretched her neck slightly, sniffing the breeze. Alden looked over. He didn't bark, didn't move, just waited. It was the kind of wait that didn't demand anything, the kind that simply made space for the smaller one to come forward without fear. And so the three of them kept walking. Each footprint pressed into the earth wrote a new memory beneath it. No one spoke, but somehow they all knew. On this path home, no one was walking alone anymore. By the time they stepped into the old clearing, dusk had already settled in. The wood planks on the front porch had warped slightly from damp weather, but they were familiar. So familiar that Caleb didn't need a porch light to know exactly where to step. He took off his boots, hung his flannel coat on the hook near the door, and went inside. The living room still held a faint chill from the days it had been empty. Caleb crouched down and lit the fire. Dry twigs crackled, and warm yellow light spilled into the corners of the house. Alden lay down beside the rug, calm and steady. His silhouette flickered in the glow, and just behind him, Dottie followed. Slowly, but this time, without fear. Caleb took an old wool blanket, folded it neatly, and placed it by the fireplace. It was meant for Dottie, a quiet offering, a welcome. But Dottie didn't curl into it. Instead, she shifted her small body and gently leaned into Alden's side without asking, without hesitation. Just a quiet, trusting motion that said more than words ever could. Alden didn't move, didn't even glance back. He simply lowered his muzzle, slow and steady, and rested his chin on Dottie's back. A silent promise. A dog's way of saying, "You're safe now, you don't have to carry it alone." Caleb stood for a moment, watching. He didn't speak, didn't move. Then, slowly, he pulled a wooden chair toward the window and sat down. Outside, darkness had settled in fully. But it wasn't cruel. It wasn't heavy. Just a soft black drape, dotted here and there with stars, resting quietly across the ridge. Night wind whispered through the cracks in the old wooden walls. Not cold, just empty. The kind of empty that had filled this house for years, but now, slowly, was being replaced. Not with noise, but with breath, with warmth, with presence, the kind of presence you don't have to name to feel. Caleb leaned his head back and let his eyes rest on the two shapes near the fire. One large, one small, one who had once saved lives, one who had once been saved, now lying together like the world had never been cruel, like it had always known how to hold broken things. He didn't need a radio, didn't need a book, just that chair, that fire. That sound is the soft, even rhythm of their breathing. Each breath, each rise and fall of Dottie's back, each subtle twitch of Alden's legs as he drifted between sleep and watchfulness, was like a lullaby you didn't know your heart needed. By the fire, the flames danced shadows onto the walls. Dottie's shadow curved in a soft arc, Alden's cast wide and still, like a blanket over hers. Together they made a single silhouette, quiet but unshakable. Caleb pressed his palm over his chest, right above his heart. It was still beating slowly but steadily, not like it had when he first brought Dottie home, knotted and restless. Not like the day he buried his wife beneath the pine. Just calm down now, steady, warm, just his. And in that windless night, there were no prayers, no sobs, no whispered confessions. Only peace. Peace is built from trust, from loyalty, and from the quiet, fragile courage it takes to love again even when you've been hurt before. The betrayal that is shrouded in silence, mistrust, and being treated as though you are guilty when you have done nothing wrong can sometimes be more devastating than the one that is supported by evidence. Never once did Caleb ask Dottie to stay. Alden never made an effort to stop her. They just came up every day with patience, presence, and love that did not need an explanation. And it was sufficient. If someone has ever placed blame on you without cause, if someone has ever harmed you without giving you an opportunity to speak, or if the scars of mistrust are still there, let this tale serve as a gentle reminder that not everything that is broken has to be thrown away. By simply being there, certain ties can be gradually and quietly restored. Each day. Additionally, please take your time if you are now experiencing that storm. Take a breath. Preserve what is important. Talk when it is safe to do so. Even if no one believes it yet, write down the truth. Be in the company of people who adore you without asking why, particularly if you have children or even a devoted dog who is observing and monitoring how the outside world treats you. We would like to hear from you now. Have you ever faced unjust accusations? Or supported someone while everyone else left? Tell us by leaving a comment below. Your narrative is important, perhaps more than you realize. because often the first step toward healing is simply realizing that you are not alone.